Tonight, let your mind drift into a quiet, hidden corner of London, where fog rolls silently along dimly lit streets and secrets sleep behind locked doors. In this calming mystery, you will follow Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson as they uncover the truth behind a beautiful violin carved from rare ebony, an instrument so dark and silent that its music carried madness within each note. This is not a story of violence and chaos, but a gentle journey through quiet workshops, hushed concert halls, and candlelit studies, a path where each clue is revealed softly, carrying you deeper into a world of whispers, wood shavings, and flickering lantern light. So find a comfortable place to rest, close your eyes, and breathe slowly as you listen. Allow this peaceful detective story to quiet your thoughts and ease your body into calm, guiding you towards sleep with each unfolding moment. Tonight, let mystery become your path to relaxation and drift away into a world where only silence, warmth, and truth remain. It was late evening in London, a quiet hour when the city's restless heart slowed to a muted thrum beneath layers of drifting fog. The gas lamps flickered with a tired glow, casting long, wavering shadows onto Baker Street. Inside our sitting room at 221B, the fireplace burned low, its coals shifting with soft crackles that echoed through the otherwise silent flat. I sat by the hearth reading an article on the recent parliamentary debates, feeling my eyelids grow heavy from the warmth and the rhythmic ticking of the mantel clock. Holmes sat opposite me in his armchair, eyes half closed in concentration, his violin balanced against his shoulder as he slowly drew the bow across the strings. The notes that floated into the room were quiet and searching, as though he sought not music, but an answer only he could hear. Then, a sudden knock at the door startled us both. Mrs. Hudson's gentle footsteps approached from below. Moments later, the door creaked open to reveal Inspector Lestrade standing in the dim light of the corridor. His face, usually firm with the self-assurance of a man of the law, appeared pale and worn. He stepped inside, removing his bowler hat with uncharacteristic hesitation, and for a long moment he simply stood there, his breathing shallow and uneven. Holmes placed his violin carefully on the table beside him. The shadows carved by the lamp made the sharp lines of his cheekbones appear even starker as he regarded the inspector in silence, studying every detail of his posture and expression. Lestrade's gaze darted between us before he spoke, his voice lower than usual, as if afraid the walls themselves might hear what he was about to say. He told Holmes they needed him urgently. There had been a murder, but not just any murder. He struggled to describe it, pressing his lips together, swallowing, gathering words that seemed to resist leaving his throat. Finally, he said it was unlike anything he had ever seen in all his years at Scotland Yard. For a moment, only the wind tapping softly at the window filled the silence between us. Holmes remained still, his fingertips lightly touching each other under his chin, his eyes locked on Lestrade, as if he could read the entire scene through the tremble in the man's voice. I felt a quiet unease ripple through my chest. Lestrade was not easily shaken, and whatever had unfolded this evening must have been horrific beyond measure. Holmes asked him where it had occurred. Lestrade exhaled, almost in relief to give a factual answer. He explained it was in Soho, in the small workshop of a violin maker. His words caught again when he tried to describe the state of the body, and he simply shook his head, glancing down at his hands as though they were stained by what he had seen. Holmes rose with the graceful certainty of a man whose purpose had been set into motion. He reached for his overcoat from the hook beside the fireplace and slipped it on with practiced ease. The faint scent of cold London air drifted in from the hall as Lestrade stepped aside to let him pass. Holmes picked up his hat and cane, then turned to me with a calm resolve in his gray eyes. He told me quietly that we were needed, that someone's final performance had ended in violence rather than applause. His voice was calm, almost tender in its softness, but the undertone of urgency was unmistakable. I folded my newspaper and stood, feeling the last warmth of the hearth leave my back as I prepared for the chill of the London streets. We descended the steps into the silent hallway below, the wood creaking softly beneath our boots. Outside, the city was muffled under a thin drizzle, the air heavy with the familiar scents of horse leather, chimney soot, and wet stone. A hansom cab waited by the curb, its lantern glowing like a distant star in the rolling fog. The horse shifted its weight, steam rising from its flanks into the damp night. Holmes stepped into the cab first, followed by Lestrade, who kept his gaze lowered, lost in thoughts he could not voice. I climbed in after them, closing the door against the swirling mist. As the driver cracked his reins and the cab jolted forward onto Baker Street, I caught a final glimpse of our windows glowing softly above, warm and untouched by the shadows that waited for us ahead. And so began another journey into London's darker corridors, driven not by curiosity alone, but by a sense of duty to uncover a truth hidden within human cruelty. The lamplights blurred past us in streaks of gold as we rode toward Soho, and I felt an unspoken certainty settle in my chest that this night would lead us into a mystery colder and deeper than the fog itself. The hansom cab turned off the wide thoroughfares into the narrow veins of Soho, where the flickering gas lamps seemed to struggle against the dense, drifting fog. The rhythmic clatter of the horses' hooves echoed against tall brick buildings lining both sides of the street, each one dark and silent at this hour. A faint drizzle fell from the heavy sky, coating the stones with a slick sheen that reflected the lamps in trembling, golden pools. When we reached the small square, Lestrade instructed the driver to stop before a low building tucked between a tobacconist's shop and a shuttered bakery. Its wooden sign, half hidden by mist, bore a simple inscription carved into the dark oak: Matteo Bellanti, luthier. The windows were dark, but the faint glow of lanterns flickered through the cracks in the front door, illuminating two constables who stood guard, their blue coats shining with moisture. They nodded as Lestrade led us through. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of varnish, oils, and old wood, but beneath it lay another scent, sharp, acrid, and bitter, that clung to the throat and made breathing shallow. The workshop itself was small and crowded. Wooden forms hung from the rafters like silent sentinels, each shaped into the early curves of violins, violas, and cellos. Racks of thin maple and spruce lined the walls, their surfaces sanded smooth, awaiting the luthier's practiced hands. Tiny glass bottles stood neatly arranged on a shelf above a workbench, each labeled in Bellanti's tight, elegant script, containing golden brown oils, resins, and pigments. But all sense of warmth and craftsmanship ended abruptly when my gaze fell upon the far side of the room. There, on the stone floor, lay Matteo Bellanti. His body was slumped against the leg of a heavy wooden bench. The lanterns cast shifting shadows across his face, which was horribly disfigured. The skin around his mouth and nose appeared melted and warped as though seared by fire or a powerful acid. His eyes were open, staring upwards in a frozen expression of terror and agony that no words could ever fully convey. My stomach tightened with nausea when I noticed the state of his hands, or rather, what remained of them. Both wrists ended in jagged, torn stumps, each one wrapped hastily with linen already soaked through with dark blood. Fragments of bone protruded from beneath the bandages. There were no severed hands nearby, nor any sign that he had crawled in this position after the injuries occurred. Everything suggested he had been attacked here, with no chance to escape or defend himself. Holmes stepped forward, moving silently past me as though gliding across the stone floor. He crouched beside Belanti's body, observing it with eyes that remained calm, almost detached, but never unkind. He studied the burns across the luthier's cheeks and chin, leaning in close until his aquiline nose nearly brushed the damaged skin. Then he glanced at the floor beneath Belanti, examining the faint, irregular stains of dark liquid that spread in blotches from his wrists. The only sounds in the room were the faint hiss of the lanterns and the ticking of a small brass clock mounted above the door. Time seemed suspended, holding its breath in mourning for the craftsman whose life had ended among the tools he had used since his youth. The scent of rosin and varnish mingled with the sharp bitterness of burned flesh, creating an atmosphere so heavy that I felt the urge to step outside and breathe the fog rather than remain within. Holmes rose slowly, his tall frame casting a long shadow against the opposite wall. His eyes scanned the room with precise attention, absorbing each object in its place, from the lined chisels and carved bridges to the scraps of ebony and rosewood scattered on the bench. Nothing escaped his notice, and though he said nothing, I could almost hear the silent cadence of his mind arranging clues, discarding assumptions, and mapping the invisible threads that bound this death to its cause. Lestrade moved closer to the corpse, his face strained as he swallowed against the smell. He informed Holmes that Belanti had been found by his apprentice, who lived above the shop. The young man, distraught and inconsolable, was waiting outside with another constable, having found his master dead upon returning from dinner at a nearby inn. There were no signs of forced entry, no shattered glass, no broken locks, only death, swift and violent, left behind in a room that smelled of music, wood, and now the end of human hope. Holmes did not respond immediately. He moved to the large workbench, fingers hovering above small bottles and folded cloths, careful not to touch anything. His gaze lingered upon a nearly finished violin lying upon a faded velvet cloth, its surface reflecting the lantern light in an eerie, almost liquid darkness. I felt the quiet press of dread grow heavier in my chest. There was something about that instrument, even unfinished, that drew the eye and refused to release it. Without turning, Holmes spoke in a low, thoughtful voice, telling us to preserve the scene exactly as it was. His tone carried a calm finality that brooked no interruption. Then he knelt once more beside Belanti, studying the ragged ends of the man's arms with narrowed eyes, the faint lines of concentration deepening across his forehead. The workshop was silent except for the flicker of the lanterns and the distant roll of carriage wheels outside. In that quiet, standing among half-finished violins and the scent of burned flesh, I felt the true weight of human cruelty pressed down upon us all. I knew in that moment this murder would be unlike any Holmes and I had faced before. There was an invisible darkness here, old and rooted, that had claimed Belanti with savage certainty, and though we did not yet know its name, we would follow its trail wherever it led, into the deepest shadows of London and perhaps beyond. Holmes remained kneeling beside Belanti's body for several long minutes, observing the ruined face and torn wrists with a stillness that seemed almost inhuman. Finally he rose, his movements silent, and turned his attention to the violin that rested upon the workbench. I followed his gaze, feeling a faint chill ripple along my spine as I looked at the instrument under the flickering lantern light. Unlike the other violins scattered around the room with their warm hues of amber and chestnut, this one was carved from wood so dark that it absorbed rather than reflected light. Its surface was polished to a deep black sheen, creating the illusion of endless depth, like staring into the heart of a moonless night. Holmes stepped closer, his gloved fingers hovering just above the ebony body without making contact. The violin was nearly complete, its graceful curves already defined, and its scroll carved with intricate precision. But what drew his attention, and mine, were the strings. At first glance they appeared thin and brown-black, wound tightly from tailpiece to peg box in delicate coils. Yet as Holmes leaned forward, narrowing his eyes, he noted their texture, so fine that it almost seemed organic. He brought his face close, inhaling lightly, and paused. The scent that rose from them was faint, but distinct, a mingling of oil, resin, and something faintly metallic that clung to the air long after he straightened. I asked Holmes quietly what he saw. He did not answer immediately, instead studying the strings from multiple angles, tilting his head to examine the way they refracted the dim light of the lanterns. Then he spoke in a calm voice that carried neither fear nor shock, only grim certainty. He said these strings were unmistakably made from human hair. I felt my stomach twist at the words, the room seeming to tilt around me as though gravity itself recoiled in disgust. Human hair, dark and fine, spun and twisted into strings for a violin. I tried to imagine the process of collecting it, treating it, dyeing it to this brown-black shade, oiling it so it would remain supple under tension. The thought alone was nearly unbearable. Holmes continued to observe the instrument, taking in the small details with silent efficiency. The wood was ebony, but not the common variety used for fingerboards. This was a rare African ebony, its grain so tight it appeared as one solid sheet of blackness, devoid of any warm undertone. Along the edges of the violin's belly, faint carvings wound in thin patterns that resembled calligraphic symbols or tribal markings, partially obscured by the unfinished varnish that coated it. He asked Lestrade if anyone had moved the violin since Belanti was found. Lestrade shook his head, saying the constables had been under strict orders not to touch anything. Holmes nodded with silent approval, then leaned forward once more, scanning the workbench surrounding the instrument. Small pots of dark oil sat nearby, their lids off, and the air around them smelled pungent and bitter. Fine brushes, each stained black, lay neatly arranged on a folded cloth, and a small leather pouch sat half open, revealing tufts of coarse dark hair within. For a brief moment, as the lantern flickered in a sudden draft, the violin's dark surface seemed almost alive, its polished ebony reflecting shapes that twisted with the shadows. I felt a deep discomfort staring at it, as if it were not merely an object, but something watching us in return, waiting silently with a purpose yet unrevealed. Holmes finally stood upright, his eyes fixed on the violin as though seeing beyond its material form into the darkness from which it was born. He spoke softly, his voice carrying the subtle tremor of reverence he reserved only for instruments of fine craftsmanship, even those tainted by horror. He said this was no ordinary commission. Its materials, its design, and its strings spoke of something far older and deeper than European lutherie. This was an instrument born of ritual, of belief, of fear and reverence twisted into one. Lestrade shifted uncomfortably beside me, his eyes darting to the violin and away, as though the thought of human hair woven into music strings was too grotesque to contemplate. I watched Holmes carefully, noticing the faint tightening of his jaw, the narrowing of his gray eyes. He was tracing connections within his mind, mapping a path from this dark workshop to the hidden motives behind such a creation. Outside, the drizzle intensified into a quiet rain, tapping softly against the small window panes, filling the silence with a calming rhythm at odds with the horror before us. The scent of ebony oil, rosin, burned flesh, and bitter varnish filled the room, mingling into an aroma that would linger in my memory for years to come. Holmes spoke at last, saying we must discover who ordered such an instrument, for no craftsman would build something like this of his own volition. Its purpose was clear in its construction, not merely to produce music, but to command it, to control something or someone through sound shaped by darkness. We stood there in the workshop, surrounded by half-carved violins and silent chisels, with the black violin resting before us like a relic upon an altar. In that moment I felt we had crossed a threshold from the realm of rational crime into a mystery rooted in the darkest reaches of human intention. And deep within my chest, I felt a quiet certainty that this violin would lead us far beyond what even Holmes believed possible. Holmes stood before the violin for a long while, his tall frame unmoving under the dim lantern glow that filled the workshop with its warm, flickering light. Outside, the rain continued to fall steadily, drumming against the small windows in a calm, rhythmic pattern that contrasted sharply with the unsettling presence of the black violin resting before us. With careful precision, he pulled on his thin leather gloves, smoothing them tightly over each finger, ensuring that not a trace of his skin would touch the surface of the instrument. He then reached forward, his movements deliberate and silent, and lifted the violin from the velvet cloth upon which it rested. The wood was so dark that in his hands it appeared almost like a void, a sliver of moonless night carved into shape. Holding it at eye level, Holmes tilted it slowly back and forth under the lantern to observe its grain and craftsmanship. He studied the curves of the body, the way the purfling traced its edges in delicate lines, and the carved scroll that ended in a smooth, rounded volute, its surface polished to mirror-like darkness. He brought the violin closer to his face, examining the strings with particular care. They were wound so finely that from a distance they might be mistaken for silk. Yet, up close, their texture betrayed them. Each string held minute irregularities along its length, tiny imperfections that spoke of their origin. They were not spun from gut, nor crafted from metal or synthetic fiber. They were strands of human hair, dyed to this brown-black shade, twisted together and oiled with a substance so pungent it filled the immediate air with a sharp, bitter aroma. Holmes inhaled lightly, his nose hovering near the fingerboard. He identified the scent immediately, stating in a calm, quiet voice that it was camphor and bitter resin mixed with something else, something far more acrid and chemical that he could not yet name. The smell was so potent it stung his eyes, and he turned away slightly, blinking once before regaining his focus. He then set the violin down upon the workbench and removed a small magnifying lens from his coat pocket. Leaning over the body of the instrument, he studied its surface inch by inch. The fine carvings along the edges, partially obscured by layers of dark oil, formed swirling patterns that appeared almost like ancient calligraphy. They curved and looped in sequences that suggested ritualistic symbols rather than decorative motifs. Under the magnifying lens, he saw faint residues trapped within these carvings, a dark brown powder that had been pressed into the grooves before the final varnish was applied. Lestrade shifted beside me, fidgeting with his hat as he watched Holmes work in silence. The inspector's face was tense with impatience and discomfort, unable to find ease in this room that smelled of oil, death, and something far older than either. Holmes adjusted his lens once more, focusing upon the scroll. It was carved from the same ebony as the body, with a smoothness that bespoke hours of meticulous chiseling and polishing. He noted that near the very tip, a thin line had been cut into the wood and filled with a hardened black resin. Tracing it gently with his gloved finger, he confirmed it was not a decorative detail, but rather a sealing mark, a symbol of ownership or perhaps ritual completion. He paused, lifting his gaze to us, and spoke with quiet gravity. He explained that the wood was African ebony of a type now nearly extinct, harvested from old-growth trees in Western and Central Africa. Its density and darkness made it prized for fingerboards, but using it to carve an entire violin body was rare, costly, and carried a meaning beyond aesthetics. Such wood was considered sacred in several cultures, reserved only for ritual instruments used in ceremonies of deep significance. Holmes set down his magnifying lens and rested his palms upon the edge of the workbench, leaning forward slightly as he studied the violin in silence. The lantern light shimmered across the polished ebony surface, its darkness appearing almost liquid, as though if one touched it, their fingers might sink into its depths and never return. He remained motionless for several long minutes, lost in thought. Outside, the rain drummed gently against the windows, its calming rhythm filling the silence with a tranquil melancholy. Within the workshop, however, the air felt heavy, thick with the presence of something unspoken. Holmes finally straightened and turned towards Lestrade, his gray eyes sharp and focused, with the clarity that only emerged when his mind had begun to map the shadows before him. He said that this violin was no ordinary commission, that whoever ordered it sought more than an instrument. Its design, its materials, and its strings of human hair spoke of a purpose rooted in belief and ritual rather than art. This was not music meant to be heard in a concert hall. It was music intended to command something unseen. Lestrade swallowed hard, glancing once more at the violin before turning away, as though the sight of it burned his eyes. I felt a faint tremor along my own spine at Holmes's words, not because of fear alone, but because of the quiet certainty in his voice. He spoke not as a man who speculated, but as one who had already glimpsed the truth awaiting us beyond the darkness of this workshop. The violin sat upon the workbench in perfect silence, its polished surface gleaming under the lantern light. Yet in that silence, I felt the faint echo of something deeper, a soundless note vibrating through the room, promising that this was only the beginning. Holmes remained silent after his examination of the black violin. He stood near the workbench, his eyes fixed upon the instrument with a contemplative stillness that seemed to draw the shadows closer around him. Lestrade shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat as if to break the tension that pressed upon us like the heavy London fog gathering outside. Holmes finally moved, his gaze scanning the cluttered surface of the workbench. Scattered between small glass bottles of dark varnish and folded cloths lay stacks of thin notebooks bound in faded brown leather. Their edges were stained with years of oil and dust, their spines creased from frequent handling. Holmes reached for the topmost ledger, lifting it with delicate care as though it were an artifact of fragile importance. He flipped it open slowly, the worn pages crackling under his gloved fingers. The faint scent of aged paper rose between us, mingling with the pungent bitterness of varnish and camphor that filled the air. I stepped closer, peering over his shoulder as he turned each page with quiet precision. Inside, rows of neat handwriting marched across the yellowed paper. The ink was dark brown, slightly faded, but the script remained elegant and easily legible. Each line listed orders, dates, materials, and clients in meticulous order, as though Belanti's mind had mirrored Holmes's own, demanding absolute organization and clarity. Holmes read aloud in a calm, steady voice, his words blending with the gentle tapping of rain against the window panes. He noted commissions for violins in maple and spruce, repairs for old Italian instruments, restorations of bows, and orders for carved tailpieces in rosewood. Each entry carried a small note in Italian, brief remarks about varnish blends or delivery arrangements. Then, near the end of the ledger, Holmes's hand paused. His eyes narrowed slightly as he examined the final entry. It was dated only 2 days prior, written with the same fluid precision as all the others. Yet the words themselves were jarring within this catalog of craftsmanship. For Mr. D, delivery Friday. Finish oiling with ritual blend. Holmes read it twice, his voice lowering further with each repetition. I felt the soft hairs rise along my forearms as the meaning settled between us. There was no description of the violin itself, no mention of ebony, no reference to hairstrings or carved symbols. Only this curt instruction for delivery and the mention of a ritual blend. Lestrade frowned deeply, leaning in to read the entry himself. He asked Holmes if Belanti was in the habit of using ritual oils for his instruments. Holmes replied calmly that traditional luthiers often used oils blended with herbs and resins to finish violins, each formula passed down through generations to create a signature scent and sheen. But the use of the word ritual implied something beyond tradition, a purpose rooted in belief or ceremonial intention. Holmes flipped back several pages to examine Belanti's previous entries, scanning each line with the silent efficiency of a hawk watching its prey. There were no other references to Mr. D. The name appeared only here in the final note Belanti ever wrote. Holmes closed the ledger softly, his gloved thumb resting upon its cracked leather cover for a moment, before he set it down beside the violin. He moved to a smaller notebook, its cover darker and its binding tighter than the others. Opening it, he found pages of chemical recipes written in tight Italian script. Oils, resins, dyes, and varnishes were listed in precise measurements, with occasional notes about wood absorption rates and drying times. Near the back, Holmes found a list of special blends. Many carried names in Italian: golden sun varnish, aged oak patina, burnt amber finish, but one entry stood out, written in slightly different ink. Ritual blend, bitter resin, camphor oil, blackwood extract mixed with crushed root and dark powder. Holmes read it slowly, his eyes narrowing with each word. He noted that these ingredients were not typical of lutherie. Some might add bitter resin or camphor in small amounts to deter insects, but the mention of crushed root and dark powder suggested an origin in traditional medicine or ceremonial concoctions rather than violin finishing. Lestrade asked Holmes what it meant. Holmes replied softly that they were seeing only fragments of a larger intention. Belanti had created something here, under commission from a man who concealed his full name, using materials and oils that pointed towards a purpose far beyond beauty of tone. He closed the small notebook, placing it atop the larger ledger with deliberate care, as though laying the first 2 stones of a foundation he was building within his mind. The workshop remained silent around us, the violin resting dark and ominous under the flickering lantern light. Holmes stood straight, his gray eyes reflecting a distant focus as he turned towards Lestrade. He said they must discover the true identity of Mr. D. Only then would the purpose of this black violin come into full light. Outside, the rain fell harder, tapping steadily against the glass like soft fingers knocking at a locked door. Within the workshop, the scent of varnish, oil, and burned flesh remained heavy in the stillness, holding us in its oppressive grasp. In that silence, I felt that what we had uncovered was not merely a crime of greed or passion, but a mystery reaching deeper into the hidden crevices of human intention, where beauty, power, and darkness intertwined beyond our comprehension. Holmes stood silently before the two notebooks, his tall frame casting a long, flickering shadow across the workshop floor. The faint scent of bitter resin and burned flesh continued to linger in the air, mingling with the smell of damp wool from our coats. Outside, the rain fell in an unbroken curtain, tapping steadily against the windows with a rhythm so gentle it felt almost mocking within the cold stillness of the room. Lestrade shifted his weight, glancing uneasily at the black violin resting upon the workbench. He cleared his throat and spoke in a low voice, saying that during their preliminary investigations, they had uncovered a possible name behind the mysterious Mr. D. Holmes turned his gaze upon the inspector, his eyes steady and calm, waiting. Lestrade explained that among Belanti's personal letters, stacked neatly in a small wooden tray near the cash box, they had found an envelope addressed to him from a man named Daniel Forsyth. The letterhead bore a discreet embossed mark reading Forsyth Private Collection, Mayfair. The message was short, written in brisk, business-like sentences that revealed little emotion. Forsyth thanked Belanti for acquiring the rare African ebony and expressed his desire to see the finished violin in person upon delivery. Holmes reached for the letter without a word. Lifting it delicately from Lestrade's gloved hands, he held it beneath the lantern, reading each line with meticulous focus. The handwriting was sharp, elegant, and slanted, suggesting education and practiced confidence. There was no closing sentiment, only the signature, Daniel Forsyth, followed by a thin line drawn beneath the name, as though to underline finality. Lestrade told Holmes that Forsyth was known in certain art circles as a collector of African artifacts, masks, statues, ceremonial tools, pieces acquired over years of private buying trips and discreet auctions. Some were displayed publicly in galleries across London. Others were said to be kept in a private collection within his Mayfair townhouse, a place few visitors ever entered. Holmes folded the letter and slipped it back into its envelope, tapping it lightly against his gloved palm. His eyes remained fixed upon the dark violin as he spoke in a voice so quiet that the falling rain outside nearly drowned it out. He said that Forsyth's interest in this instrument was not rooted in music alone. It was evident in the materials chosen, in the ritualistic blend of oils, and in the secrecy surrounding its commission. This violin was to become part of something greater than mere collection. It was a piece within a purpose. Lestrade shifted again, frowning deeply. He said that Scotland Yard intended to bring Forsyth in for questioning the following day. Holmes nodded absently, his mind clearly mapping out a path far beyond the confines of this dimly lit workshop. He moved to the workbench, his gloved fingers tracing the edges of the black violin without touching it directly. His gaze drifted along the surface of the ebony wood, over the twisted human hair strings, to the carved symbols, partially hidden beneath the oil finish. I watched him closely, sensing his thoughts moving rapidly beneath his calm exterior. To Holmes, Daniel Forsyth was not simply a suspect or client. He was a piece of a puzzle whose shape was only beginning to emerge. This man, with his collection of African artifacts and hidden rooms in Mayfair, had commissioned an instrument built from sacred wood, bound with human hair, and sealed with oils blended from bitter resin and crushed root. The violin was not an object of music alone. It was a vessel for something older, something Forsyth believed he could possess. Holmes finally turned away from the violin and looked at Lestrade, his gray eyes filled with a quiet, focused intensity. He told the inspector to ensure Forsyth was brought in at dawn. There was no time to waste, for the true purpose of this violin and the deaths that had begun to surround it would soon come into focus. Holmes's voice carried the calm certainty of a man who saw not only what lay before him, but the shadows stretching out behind it. Lestrade nodded solemnly, slipping the envelope back into his pocket. He signaled to the constables waiting outside to prepare for departure. Holmes removed his gloves carefully, folding them into his coat pocket before picking up his cane from where it rested against the bench. The faint tapping of rain upon the windows grew louder as a sudden gust swept down the narrow street beyond. As we stepped out of the workshop into the cool, damp air, I turned back once more. The lanterns flickered within the small room, casting their golden glow upon the black violin that remained resting upon its velvet cloth. For a brief moment, I thought I saw it pulse softly under the light, as though breathing in the shadows left behind by its creator. I followed Holmes and Lestrade down the slick stone steps to the waiting hansom cab. Above us, the gas lamps blurred in the steady rain, glowing like distant orbs suspended in the fog. As we climbed inside, I felt the quiet certainty settle within me that this was no ordinary case. We were descending into a darkness far deeper than murder alone. And at its center waited a man who believed that power could be carved from sacred wood and woven with human hair, his intentions hidden behind the elegant doors of Mayfair. The rain followed us through the streets of London as the hansom cab carried us away from Soho, the steady rhythm of droplets against the roof mingling with the muted clatter of hooves upon slick cobblestones. Holmes sat opposite me in silence, his eyes fixed upon some unseen horizon beyond the rain-slicked glass. The dim glow of the gas lamps along the avenues cast fleeting shadows across his sharp features, revealing only the faint furrow of concentration between his brows. When we arrived back at Baker Street, the fog had thickened into a dense veil that swallowed the lamps in dim halos of gold. Mrs. Hudson met us at the door, her eyes widening when she saw our weary faces, but Holmes simply nodded to her, requesting tea before disappearing into the sitting room with his coat still damp from the rain. I followed him up the stairs, feeling the quiet hush of the house settle around us as I removed my own wet overcoat and placed it upon the stand. Holmes sat before the fireplace, leaning forward to light the lamp upon the small table beside his chair. Its glow filled the room with warm, golden light, illuminating the violin resting upon his knee, his own beloved Stradivarius, not the black instrument we had left under constable guard in Soho. He rested his fingertips lightly upon the strings but did not play. Instead, he sat in silence for a moment, his eyes unfocused and distant. I watched him quietly, sensing that his mind was not upon the events of the day alone, but upon something deeper, drawn forth from the recesses of his vast knowledge. Finally, he spoke in a calm, low voice, his words carrying the quiet cadence of a man recalling a memory long hidden beneath layers of newer facts. He told me there was an old legend that spoke of a violin carved from sacred ebony, a story born far from the fog of London in the dense forests of Western Africa. It was said that long ago, among people enslaved and transported from their lands, there existed a belief in an instrument carved from the heartwood of an ancient ebony tree. This tree was revered by their ancestors as a guardian spirit, its wood believed to contain the power to call forth visions and truths hidden beyond human sight. Holmes continued softly, describing how the legend told of a violin carved in secret by those enslaved, using tools smuggled or improvised within the darkness of shipholds or plantation sheds. Its strings were spun from human hair, often taken from those who had perished, twisted and oiled with a bitter resin prepared in rituals of mourning and remembrance. This violin, according to the legend, could produce music that crossed the boundary between life and death. Its tones could entrance the mind, guiding it towards peace, or, when played with violent intention, could drive listeners into madness. He paused, his eyes lowering to the polished wood of his own violin resting across his knee. The lamplight gleamed along its warm maple back, a gentle contrast to the vision of the black violin still vivid within both our minds. Holmes said that the legend also warned of those who tried to steal such an instrument. For them, its music brought not clarity or comfort, but a gnawing madness that grew with each note, until mind and soul dissolved into a darkness beyond saving. Outside, the rain continued to fall in a quiet, unbroken rhythm, filling the room with its calm, steady whisper. I felt the weight of Holmes's words settle around us like the fog pressing upon the city streets. This was no mere folk story to him. His tone carried the certainty of a man who understood the power of belief and how objects born of faith and suffering carried a presence beyond their material form. Holmes leaned back into his chair, resting his violin gently upon the side table. His eyes met mine in the lamplight, gray and calm, yet shadowed by a solemn understanding. He said that Forsyth, in commissioning such a violin, was not merely seeking a rare artifact. He was seeking dominion over something sacred, twisting it into a possession to be displayed for power or pride. Holmes's voice fell to a whisper as he concluded that such desecration never ended without consequence. Those who carved beauty from suffering often unleashed something far darker upon themselves. The room fell silent once more, save for the ticking of the mantel clock and the soft patter of rain upon the windows. Holmes folded his hands before him and closed his eyes, lost within thoughts I could neither follow nor disturb. I sat in my chair, staring into the flickering fireplace, feeling the warmth upon my skin, yet sensing a chill settle deeper within my chest. For the first time since we entered Belanti's workshop, I realized that what lay ahead would not be solved by deduction alone. The darkness within this case carried a weight of grief and cruelty that no logic could wash away. And in that quiet moment, with Holmes lost in the legend of the ebony violin, I felt we had stepped beyond the boundaries of ordinary crime into a realm where history, pain, and belief converged to create a mystery darker than any London night. Morning came slowly to London, pale and damp beneath a blanket of stubborn fog. The street outside Baker Street lay quiet under the early hour, with only the faint creak of a milk cart echoing between the tall rows of brownstone buildings. Holmes had not slept. I found him seated by the window, his silhouette framed against the shifting gray light, a cup of untouched tea resting on the small table beside him. His violin lay across his knees, but he made no move to play it. His eyes remained fixed on the drifting fog beyond the glass, lost in silent calculation. I prepared a modest breakfast of eggs and toast, hoping to draw him back from the labyrinth of his thoughts. He barely glanced at the plate before turning his gaze to the morning edition that lay folded upon the edge of the table. Its headline caught my attention immediately, the heavy block letters screaming their horror across the page. Renowned violinist commits murder and suicide in violent madness. I felt my throat tighten as I read the words aloud. Sophia Carlin, a rising virtuoso in the London Philharmonic, had been found dead at dawn. According to witnesses, she had spent the evening rehearsing a solo piece with a new violin acquired only days before from a private collection. During the night, neighbors heard screams from her townhouse. Police forced entry to find her husband lying lifeless upon the parlor rug, his chest and neck pierced 27 times by a dining knife. Sophia herself had been found in the courtyard below their balcony, her body twisted upon the stone tiles, her nightdress soaked with blood. The report stated that before leaping to her death, she had stabbed herself repeatedly along her arms and shoulders as if trying to tear something out from beneath her skin. Her eyes, wide and unseeing, were described as filled with a terror so profound that the constables had been shaken long after leaving the scene. Holmes remained silent as I read. When I lowered the paper, I saw his gaze had shifted from the window to the floor, his gray eyes shadowed by a quiet, focused dread. He asked me in a low voice whether the article mentioned the violin's provenance. I read further, my hands trembling slightly against the newsprint. It stated only that the violin was part of the Forsyth collection, an ebony instrument recently acquired and loaned to Miss Carlin for a private rehearsal of her upcoming solo performance. Holmes leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers before his lips. His eyes closed, and for a moment I saw the faint tremor of his chest as he exhaled a long, silent breath. He spoke softly then, saying that the legend's warning had proven true. This violin, carved from sacred wood and strung with human hair, was no longer merely an object of ritual significance. In Forsyth's hands, it had become a weapon that killed not with blade or poison, but through the unraveling of the mind itself. He rose from his chair with quiet purpose, setting aside his untouched tea. The soft creak of the floorboards under his weight broke the morning's hush. Moving to his writing desk, he gathered his leather notebook, slipping it into the inner pocket of his coat. His movements were calm, deliberate, yet carried an urgency I recognized from countless past cases. A silent signal that he had seen the path forward, however dark it might prove to be. He told me we would visit Forsyth that afternoon. There was no time to waste. Each moment that violin remained within his possession was a moment that carried the threat of madness and death to whoever next drew its bow. I asked him quietly what he believed Forsyth's true intentions to be. Holmes paused by the door, his tall figure framed against the pale morning light flooding in from the hallway. He said that power was a hunger that devoured all reason, and that Forsyth was no mere collector. He was a man who believed he could bend history, ritual, and beauty into submission beneath his own will. Outside, the city stirred awake under the drifting fog. The rattle of iron gates, the hush of broom bristles along pavements, and the distant toll of morning bells blended into a quiet chorus of life returning to its daily rhythms. Yet within me, a cold certainty settled that today would mark the beginning of a darkness that no dawn could fully dispel. I donned my coat and hat, feeling the reassuring weight of my medical bag slung across my shoulder. As Holmes stepped out onto Baker Street, his boots striking the wet stone pavement with measured confidence, I followed him with a silent prayer that our search for truth would not come at the cost of more innocent lives, for the violin's music had already claimed its first madness, and as we walked into the gray morning, I feared it would not be its last. By the time we reached Mayfair that afternoon, the rain had lightened to a thin, persistent drizzle that left the cobblestones shining beneath the overcast sky. The hansom cab carried us through quiet streets, lined with elegant townhouses, their facades pristine under the soft gray light. Iron gates framed polished marble steps leading to tall, dark painted doors adorned with brass knockers in the shapes of lions, falcons, and mythological beasts. Behind curtained windows, lamps glowed with a muted warmth, shielding their inhabitants from the damp chill of the day. Our cab stopped before an imposing three-story townhouse of pale stone, its windows tall and arched, each draped with heavy velvet curtains of deep burgundy. The brass plate beside the polished door bore a single name, etched in sharp, modern letters: Daniel Forsyth. Holmes stepped down first, his tall frame unfolding with silent precision. He paused for a moment beneath the stone archway, his eyes scanning the building's exterior with a calm, unreadable expression. Then he raised the polished knocker and struck it once against the door. The hollow echo faded into silence before quiet footsteps approached from within. The door swung open to reveal a butler dressed in a dark morning coat, his posture rigid and formal. Without speaking, he stepped aside, allowing us to enter a foyer lined with polished marble tiles that gleamed beneath the chandelier's glow. The air was warm, carrying a faint scent of beeswax polish and distant incense. We were led through a wide corridor adorned with framed maps of Africa and India, their pale linen surfaces covered with neat black script denoting rivers, kingdoms, and trade route. The walls displayed masks carved from wood and ivory, each mounted upon black velvet boards. Some were familiar ceremonial masks I had seen in museum catalogs. Others depicted faces so stylized and severe that I felt them watching us as we passed, their hollow eyes following each movement. At the end of the hall, tall double doors of dark mahogany opened into a room filled with shadow and golden lamplight. The butler announced us in a voice devoid of emotion and withdrew, closing the doors silently behind him. The room was vast and lined with tall display cabinets of glass and dark wood. Within them sat hundreds of objects arranged in precise symmetry: carved figurines, polished stone tools, beaded ceremonial ornaments, slender ivory tusks etched with spiral patterns, and small wooden statues with eyes inset in brass or copper. The air smelled of old wood varnish and faintly of dried herbs. Daniel Forsyth stood near a display table at the center of the room, his back to us as he adjusted a mask mounted upon a small wooden stand. He was a tall man, dressed in a tailored suit of dark gray wool, his hair slicked back to reveal a high, pale forehead. When he turned, I noted the angular sharpness of his features, the slight hollowness beneath his eyes, and the curve of his mouth that suggested a constant, dismissive amusement with the world around him. Holmes inclined his head in greeting. Forsyth studied him with cold curiosity, his dark eyes lingering upon Holmes's face before shifting to me, then returning with fleeting interest. His gaze carried the weight of a man accustomed to being observed, never judged. Holmes introduced us calmly, his tone polite but devoid of any warmth. Forsyth responded with a faint smile that did not touch his eyes. He gestured languidly towards a long table covered in black velvet, upon which lay the ebony violin. Its dark surface glowed softly under the lamplight, each curve and carved detail emerging like shadows from a moonless night. Forsyth spoke, his voice smooth, refined, and carrying an undercurrent of faint impatience. He said that he assumed Holmes had come to admire his latest acquisition. He described it as a masterpiece carved from the heart of African ebony, its construction commissioned from Belanti to mirror legends of sacred instruments. Forsyth's tone suggested that he regarded this violin as merely another trophy among the hundreds within the room. Holmes moved closer to the violin, his gaze fixed upon it with quiet focus. Forsyth continued, explaining that Belanti's death was unfortunate but irrelevant to the instrument's value. He spoke with the clinical detachment of a man describing an art dealer's bankruptcy, rather than a brutal murder that had left the luthier disfigured and mutilated in his own workshop. Holmes asked Forsyth if he believed in the legends surrounding such instruments. Forsyth gave a small laugh, soft and dismissive, saying that legends existed only to make beauty more alluring to the human mind. He called them quaint and superstitious, then added that the violin would soon be displayed as the centerpiece of his collection during an upcoming private gathering of connoisseurs and historians. I felt a quiet unease growing in my chest as I listened to his voice. There was no reverence in his words, only possession. He regarded the violin not as an instrument born of sacred ritual and suffering, but as an object to be admired and envied, its darkness only adding to its monetary and social value. Holmes remained silent for several moments, his eyes locked upon the instrument. Then he spoke softly, telling Forsyth that he would require access to Belanti's other records and to any correspondence or materials related to the commission. Forsyth raised an eyebrow, his faint smile returning as he replied that Scotland Yard could contact his solicitor, but he had no intention of delaying his showcase. To him, the violin was merely a fine acquisition, and the deaths surrounding it were coincidental tragedies far beneath his concern. Holmes studied him with the detached calm of a surgeon examining a malignancy. For a moment the room fell silent, the only sound the faint ticking of a bronze carriage clock upon a nearby cabinet. Then Holmes thanked him politely for his time and turned away, gesturing for me to follow. As we left the collector's mansion, stepping back into the gray drizzle of late afternoon, I felt the chills sink deep into my bones. Holmes walked ahead in silence, his long coat stirring lightly with each step. I knew from the faint tension in his shoulders and the narrowed focus of his gaze that Forsyth's indifference had confirmed a truth he had already begun to suspect. This man saw beauty only in power, and power only in ownership, and for such men the cost of life was no cost at all. The drizzle had eased to a mist by the time we returned to Baker Street, but the fog remained dense and unmoving, shrouding the city in a quiet gray hush that muffled every wheel, hoof, and distant shout into a faint ghostly echo. Holmes removed his coat and gloves upon entering, hanging them neatly upon the stand before moving directly to his writing desk, where he sat with an abrupt stillness that spoke of deep thought, coiling tightly within him. I prepared tea for us both, the clinking of china cups the only sound in the warm, dim room. Holmes did not touch his tea. Instead, he leaned forward in his chair, elbows resting upon his knees, his hands steepled beneath his chin, as he stared into the unlit hearth. The lamplight illuminated the sharp lines of his face, casting his eyes in shadow and turning his expression into one of silent, focused severity. After several long minutes, he rose and crossed the room to a narrow cabinet built into the wall beside his bookshelf. Unlocking it with a small brass key from his pocket, he withdrew a slim leather case lined with padded compartments. From within, he selected 2 glass vials and a folded paper of testing strips. With these in hand, he turned back to me, his expression calm but edged with urgency. He said he must confirm a suspicion before it grew into certainty. Then he gestured for me to follow him downstairs. We descended to the small back room that served as Holmes's chemical laboratory, its stone walls lined with shelves of neatly labeled bottles containing powders, oils, solvents, acids, and reagents. The air smelled faintly of iodine, coal gas, and bitter plant extracts, mingled with the cool dampness that always lingered in the underground chamber. Holmes placed the 2 glass vials upon the counter before him, then reached into his inner coat pocket to withdraw a small cloth pouch. As he unfolded it, I recognized the dark flecks clinging to its interior, dried remnants of the oily residue he had scraped from the ebony violin during our examination at Belanti's workshop. He worked in silence, pouring a few grains into one vial, adding clear solvent from the other, and swirling the mixture gently until the residue dissolved into a thin, dark solution. He dipped a thin testing strip into the vial and held it beneath the overhead lamp. Within seconds, the white paper turned a dark, mossy green. Holmes's eyes narrowed, his expression tightening with grim confirmation. He moved swiftly to a small shelf and selected another bottle, removing its glass stopper and inhaling its contents lightly before replacing it. The acrid scent of camphor filled the air, sharp and bitter. Then he spoke, his voice calm, yet carrying a quiet dread. He said that the oil used to finish the black violin contained an arsenic-based compound, blended with plant neurotoxins. These substances, absorbed through the skin in minute quantities, would accumulate within the bloodstream, targeting the brain's delicate pathways. The result was not immediate death, but progressive psychosis, hallucinations, paranoia, violent mania, and eventual collapse into madness or suicide. I felt a tightness settle in my chest as I watched him clean his instruments, his movements methodical and silent. The idea that each contact with the violin's polished surface could drive a person to insanity was horrifying enough, but the realization that Forsyth must have known, must have understood the true nature of what he possessed, weighed upon the room with suffocating certainty. Holmes poured the remaining solution into a ceramic disposal jar, rinsing the vials before returning them to their padded case. His face remained calm, but his eyes carried the shadow of anger, that cold, silent anger, reserved only for crimes committed with deliberate cruelty, masked as elegant indifference. He finally spoke, saying that the toxic blend within the violin was no accident of material or process. It was intentional. Whoever had designed this instrument had meant for its touch to enslave the mind, to transform music into a weapon of control and destruction. Holmes said that Forsyth's dismissive confidence revealed everything. To him, this violin was more than art. It was power wielded with impunity against those too innocent to understand its darkness. We left the laboratory in silence, ascending back to the sitting room, where the ticking of the mantel clock filled the warm hush with its calm, measured rhythm. Holmes moved to the window, gazing out at the fog-draped city beyond the glass. His reflection stared back at him, pale and silent, its gray eyes filled with quiet resolve. He spoke softly, almost to himself, saying that beauty corrupted by cruelty became nothing more than another weapon in the hands of those who saw the world as something to own and command. And in that moment, I understood the depth of his intent. This case was no longer about a single murder, nor even the madness it had unleashed. It was about restoring a truth Forsyth had buried beneath layers of polished wood, ancient legend, and human suffering. The violin was not merely an object to Holmes. It was a silent cry for justice carved from sacred darkness, its voice twisted into a lament that could only be silenced if the hands that corrupted it were brought into the light. That evening, the fog thickened into a damp shroud that muffled London's gaslit streets in hushed grays and blacks. The city's usual clang of carriage wheels and distant voices fell away, replaced by the quiet drip of rain from eaves and the occasional rattle of iron gates caught in the breeze. Inside Baker Street, Holmes sat in his armchair near the window, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze locked upon something unseen beyond the veil of fog. I could sense the silent tension coiling within him like a wound spring. I had just finished recording the day's events into my journal when there came a sharp knock at the door below, followed by Mrs. Hudson's anxious voice calling up to us. Lestrade entered moments later, his boots damp with rainwater and his hat in hand. His face was drawn and pale beneath the flickering lamplight, his eyes carrying the haunted look of a man who had seen something his mind struggled to reconcile with reason. Holmes did not move from his chair. He spoke softly, asking Lestrade what fresh horror had come to light. Lestrade swallowed before answering. His voice was low and unsteady as he explained that there had been another death. This time it was Émile Durant, the renowned conductor of the Royal Albert Hall Orchestra. Lestrade paused to steady his breathing, staring into the darkened hearth as though he could still see the scene before him. He said that Durant had collapsed in the middle of rehearsal earlier that afternoon. Musicians had described how, moments before his final descent into madness, Durant had stopped conducting abruptly. He stood frozen before the orchestra, his baton trembling in his raised hand, his gaze locked upon the ebony violin resting on its velvet-lined stand nearby. Then, without warning, Durant had dropped his baton and clutched his head between his hands. Witnesses described how he screamed words no one could understand, his voice breaking with terror and fury. He began clawing at his own face, tearing at his cheeks and brow with such force that skin and flesh gave way beneath his nails. He fell to his knees, shrieking as he dug his fingers into his eye sockets until blood streamed down his face, staining the polished wood floor beneath him. By the time the musicians reached him, Durant had collapsed in a silent heap. His breathing was shallow and ragged, his eyes ruined and blind, torn from their sockets by his own hands in a frenzy of horror. He was carried from the hall, but succumbed to his injuries and shock within the hour. Lestrade fell silent after his recounting, his knuckles white as he gripped the brim of his hat. The room remained hushed, the ticking of the mantel clock echoing like a slow, inevitable march through the heavy air. Holmes lowered his hands from his chin, his eyes half closed in thought. He asked Lestrade whether Durant had touched the violin. Lestrade said that during the rehearsal break, Durant had lifted it from its stand to inspect it, intrigued by its ebony body and the dark sheen of its varnish. Several orchestra members had seen him tracing the carved patterns along its edges with the tip of his fingers. Holmes nodded once, his face calm, yet filled with a quiet, growing dread. He said softly that the poison upon the violin's surface, absorbed even through casual contact, had begun to corrode Durant's mind within minutes. The hallucinations induced by its toxic oils, combined with the legend-bound fear woven into its creation, would drive any person of sensitive constitution to madness. Lestrade sat heavily upon the edge of the sofa, his shoulders slumped under the weight of what he had witnessed. He asked Holmes what could be done to stop further deaths. Holmes rose then, tall and composed, moving to the window where he stood in silent contemplation, his gray eyes reflecting the dim glow of the street lamps beyond the fog. He said that the violin could no longer remain in Forsyth's possession, nor in any private collection. Its very existence was an affront to the lives it had stolen. Holmes turned to face us, his voice quiet but carrying the cold, sharp certainty of iron. He stated that tomorrow they would confront Forsyth directly. The time for polite investigation had ended. Now they would reveal the truth, expose his knowledge, and ensure that no other innocent would touch the black violin again. Outside, the fog rolled past the window in thick, ghostly waves, wrapping the city in silence. Within our sitting room, the quiet felt heavier than before, as though the darkness beyond the glass pressed against the walls with unseen intent. I looked upon Holmes then and saw not only a detective ready to unearth a crime, but a man preparing to confront a darkness far older and deeper than human law alone could contain. And in that silence, I felt a quiet certainty settle within me. The violin's music had claimed its second life, and unless Holmes acted swiftly, it would not stop until every note it carried had driven another soul into madness and death. The following morning arrived without dawn. Heavy rain clouds pressed low upon London, dimming the streets into a murky twilight, even as the clock neared 8. Inside Baker Street, the lamps burned steadily, casting golden light across Holmes's cluttered laboratory table where he stood, sleeves rolled to his elbows, focused entirely upon the task before him. The room smelled sharply of alcohol spirits and camphor, tinged with the faint metallic scent of old wood and cold rain drifting in through the half-open window. Holmes's eyes, narrowed in concentration, flicked rapidly between a row of glass vials and a small porcelain dish upon which he had laid the dark, dried residue scraped from the ebony violin days before. His fingers moved with silent precision, crushing tiny grains of residue with the flat end of a glass stirring rod until they formed a fine powder. He worked without pause, adding a drop of clear reagent, swirling it gently until the mixture dissolved into a thin, dark brown solution. I stood nearby, observing him with a quiet reverence that came only in these moments, watching the razor focus of his mind transform observation into knowledge. Holmes selected a fresh pipette and transferred the solution into a shallow glass dish set upon a small brass tripod. Beneath it, a blue flame flickered from an alcohol burner, sending thin ribbons of steam curling upward as the liquid warmed. He leaned forward slightly, his sharp features illuminated by the flickering flame. The solution began to darken rapidly, turning first to a cloudy olive green, before deepening into a rich, opaque forest shade. Holmes exhaled softly through his nose, his lips pressed into a thin line. He reached for a small folded cloth upon which lay several slender testing strips, their ends dipped in faint reactive compounds. He touched one to the liquid surface, held it up beneath the lamp, and nodded almost imperceptibly when the paper turned a vivid emerald green. He spoke then in a calm, low voice, explaining that the reaction confirmed his suspicion. The oil used to finish the violin's surface contained an arsenic compound, but not the simple metallic arsenic found in household rodent poisons or industrial dyes. This blend was far more refined, combined with a concentrated extract of neurotoxic alkaloids derived from West African plant roots. Together, he explained, these created a poison that was not immediately fatal, but which passed through the skin's pores in minute amounts with each touch. He described how the compound, carried by the bloodstream to the brain, would slowly erode the natural chemical balance within the cortex and midbrain. The victim would begin to experience blurred vision, a crawling sensation along the skin, and an increasing distortion of reality. Within hours, hallucinations would deepen, Rational control would shatter, and the mind would turn upon itself, consumed by an unreasoning terror that could only end in madness or self-inflicted death. As he spoke, his voice remained quiet, each word measured with clinical precision. Yet beneath that calm tone, I heard the restrained anger that only surfaced when Holmes faced crimes committed not in sudden passion, but through cold, deliberate calculation. He rinsed the testing strip in a beaker of distilled water, his eyes remaining fixed upon the deep green solution simmering upon the tripod. The laboratory felt utterly silent around us, broken only by the soft bubbling of the heated liquid and the distant rattle of carriage wheels along the rain-slick street outside. He explained further that such a poison would not be traceable without targeted chemical analysis. To any observer, the violin's dark oil would appear merely a rich finish, its sharp camphor scent masking the bitter acridity of its true composition. This was not the work of a casual amateur or a careless collector. It was crafted with intent and knowledge, an intentional weapon hidden within the beauty of an ancient legend. Holmes extinguished the alcohol burner with a swift turn of his wrist, the blue flame vanishing with a faint hiss. The rising steam drifted into the dim corners of the laboratory, leaving the solution within the dish a thick, deep green pool of lethal truth. He removed his gloves and washed his hands thoroughly in carbolic solution, the scent of antiseptic filling the air around him. Then he turned to me, his gray eyes clear and filled with quiet resolve. He said that Forsyth knew. He knew precisely what he had commissioned, and he intended its power to remain hidden behind the beauty of its form and the prestige of its legend. Holmes's voice fell to a near whisper as he concluded that Forsyth's guilt was not that of ignorance or careless obsession. It was the guilt of a man who wielded art as a weapon, believing himself untouchable by law or conscience. He closed the leather case of testing supplies and slipped it into his coat pocket with deliberate calm. Outside, the rain drummed softly upon the windows, filling the silent laboratory with a quiet rhythm that seemed almost peaceful, though within it lay the promise of reckoning. Holmes said we would go to Forsyth that evening. The time for silent observation had ended. Now, truth would speak. And for the first time in this case, I saw within Holmes's eyes not only cold precision, but the flicker of something deeper. A grief for lives lost to a darkness disguised as beauty, and a determination that it would claim no more. Holmes remained silent as he cleaned the glass pipettes and vials, his movements deliberate and precise under the golden glow of the laboratory lamp. The faint scent of carbolic acid rose with each rinse, mingling with the sharper bitterness of camphor and resin that still lingered in the air. I watched him work, my chest tight with a growing horror that pressed deeper with each confirmed truth of his analysis. When he finally turned to face me, his gray eyes were calm but carried the shadow of an understanding I wished I did not share. He told me, in his low, steady voice, that each touch upon the violin's surface drove its handler further into madness. It did not require playing nor long exposure. The poison's potency lay in its quiet patience, seeping through the skin with every brief contact, building within the bloodstream until the mind could no longer separate reality from fear. As his words sank into me, I felt a tremor pass along my arms, a coldness that seemed to settle deep within my bones. I imagined Sophia Carlin, her slender fingers running lightly along the black violin's ebony curves as she tuned its strings, unaware that in that innocent act she sealed her fate. I saw Durant, proud and poised before his orchestra, tracing the carved symbols upon its scroll in idle curiosity, only to find his mind consumed by horrors that tore away his reason, forcing him to claw out his own eyes to escape a vision he alone could see. I sat upon the stool near the workbench, pressing the heel of my hand against my brow, trying to quell the rising nausea in my chest. The horror of these deaths was not merely their violence, but the cold deliberation of their cause. Each victim had touched beauty and found madness waiting within it. Each life lost was not the result of sudden rage or careless accident, but a slow, intentional unraveling designed by human greed and arrogance. Holmes spoke again, his voice softer now, as though he sensed the heaviness pressing upon my thoughts. He said that Forsyth planned to display the violin the following evening at a private gathering attended by collectors, musicians, and dignitaries. Holmes explained that for Forsyth, this was not merely an opportunity to showcase his collection's crown jewel. It was a demonstration of power disguised as art, a chance to reveal what he believed he alone could command. I lifted my gaze to Holmes, feeling the sharp sting of tears gather behind my eyes. I asked him in a strained whisper what could compel a man to commission such an instrument, knowing its true nature. Holmes studied me in silence for a moment, his face illuminated by the soft lamp glow, his sharp features cast into still shadows. Then he replied quietly that there existed men in this world for whom beauty was meaningless without domination. For them, every object, every person, every culture or legend was valuable only when bent beneath their will, reduced to possession rather than reverence. I felt my throat tighten with grief and disgust. The black violin was not a marvel of craftsmanship to Forsyth. It was an artifact of power, stolen from a sacred history, stripped of its purpose, and refashioned into a silent weapon that killed with elegance and secrecy. Holmes moved to the window and opened it slightly, letting the cool evening breeze drift into the laboratory. The fog had thinned, revealing the outlines of the city's rooftops against the bruised violet sky. He stood there for a moment, breathing deeply of the clean, damp air as though washing the laboratory's bitter scents from his mind. He turned back to me, his eyes calm, yet edged with quiet resolve. He said that tomorrow, Forsyth's secrets would be laid bare before those he sought to impress. Holmes would ensure that the darkness hidden within the violin's polished body would no longer remain silent. It would speak its truth, and Forsyth would answer for every life it had taken. The laboratory fell silent around us once more, filled only with the soft rustle of fog moving past the window and the quiet tick of the clock upon the shelf. I sat there, feeling the weight of all we had learned pressing into my chest, knowing that the horror of this case lay not in superstition or legend, but in the reality of human cruelty and the lives it devoured without remorse. And in that silence, I understood with certainty that the night to come would mark the end of this darkness one way or another. Night descended upon London with a heavy stillness, settling into the streets and alleys like an old, patient shadow. The rain had ceased, leaving behind a thin sheen of moisture upon every stone and iron railing, reflecting the faint gaslight in blurred pools of gold. Within Baker Street, the lamps burned low. Holmes sat at his writing desk, surrounded by an array of open volumes and folded papers spread in precise patterns across the polished wood surface. He read without pause, his eyes scanning lines of dense text with silent, unwavering focus. The books before him were old and heavy, their spines cracked with age, each filled with careful ethnographies, travel accounts, and linguistic studies from West and Central Africa. The room smelled faintly of leather bindings, ink, and the fading camphor that clung to his coat from the day's investigations. I sat across from him near the fireplace, a cup of tea cooling in my hand, watching as he moved seamlessly from one volume to the next. The ticking of the mantel clock blended with the distant rattle of a passing night cart and the soft creaks of the settling house. Hours passed unnoticed, the hush deepening until the city itself felt as though it slept in uneasy silence beyond our windows. Finally, Holmes closed the final volume with deliberate care and rested his fingertips lightly upon its cover. His eyes, gray and clear in the lamplight, lifted to meet mine. He spoke softly, his voice carrying the quiet finality of truth discovered. He explained that the violin we had found in Belanti's workshop was not merely inspired by legend. It was a direct recreation of an instrument described in old oral histories recorded by missionaries and anthropologists during the early colonial expeditions into West Africa. The accounts spoke of a ritual practice carried out among certain coastal communities in the centuries before full colonial rule. Holmes described how, in these traditions, violins or bowed lutes were carved from sacred trees believed to hold the spirits of ancestors. The wood was selected during secret ceremonies and prepared by ritual specialists who blended oils with bitter resins and crushed medicinal roots. These oils were believed to bind the instrument's music to the world of spirits, allowing its player to speak across the veil, separating the living from the dead. However, darker accounts described a variant of this practice used not for healing or ancestral communion, but for execution. Holmes paused here, his eyes darkening with the weight of the knowledge he carried. He explained that in certain punitive rituals, a condemned individual was forced to play upon such an instrument, their fingers and arms exposed to oils blended with slow-acting neurotoxins. The oils seeped into their skin as they played, and the music, shaped by pain and hallucination, was believed to guide their spirit into submission before death. Holmes lifted a small folded map from the desk, its edges worn from handling. He tapped a point along the coast of modern-day Sierra Leone, explaining that the specific ingredients listed in Belanti's notebooks matched those documented by early Portuguese and British traders. Bitter resin harvested from local trees, camphor oil imported through trade, and a root containing alkaloids used traditionally in both medicine and lethal punishment. I felt a chill ripple through my chest as he continued. He said that Forsyth's violin was not simply inspired by these histories. It was an intentional recreation, an instrument built to carry the exact toxic blend used in these rituals. The black ebony, the human hair strings, the carved symbols along the violin's edge, all were rooted in centuries-old beliefs twisted now into a possession of power by a man who saw nothing of its origin beyond his own ambition. The room fell silent as Holmes leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes briefly, as though to settle the knowledge into the ordered vaults of his mind. The lamplight flickered softly against the rows of books upon the shelves behind him, illuminating titles in Latin, Greek, Arabic, and Kikongo. Outside, the fog pressed quietly against the windows, the city hushed beneath its heavy veil. I spoke then, my voice quiet with grief. I said that what Forsyth had stolen was not only beauty or history, but something sacred. Holmes opened his eyes and met my gaze, and in that calm gray depth I saw agreement without words. He replied softly that to men like Forsyth, sacredness held no meaning beyond its potential for ownership and display. The mantel clock chimed once, its clear note echoing through the sitting room. Holmes rose from his chair and extinguished the lamp upon his desk. He moved to the window, his silhouette dark against the faint glow of the gaslights beyond the glass. In the quiet that followed, I felt the truth settle deeply within me. This case was not merely a pursuit of justice for Belanti or for the lives stolen by the violin's poison. It was a reckoning with the darkness born when human arrogance twisted faith, beauty, and ritual into tools of power. Holmes turned back to me then, his voice calm and resolute, as he said that tomorrow they would confront Forsyth with this truth. The violin's lament, carved from sacred wood and stained with human suffering, would be silenced, and its darkness would no longer remain hidden behind the polished glass of a collector's cabinet. Outside, the fog pressed on, silent and unbroken, holding the city in its patient embrace as the night deepened towards dawn. Morning came with no sun, only a dull, indifferent light diffused through heavy gray clouds. Baker Street felt quieter than usual, as though the city itself held its breath in anticipation of what this day would bring. Holmes moved with silent precision through the sitting room, gathering his notes and folding them neatly into the inner pocket of his dark wool coat. His violin remained untouched upon its stand by the window, its familiar warmth a silent contrast to the dark instrument that haunted his mind. Lestrade arrived shortly after dawn, his boots damp with rainwater and his coat flecked with droplets that caught the lamp glow in tiny silver points. He removed his hat and shook it lightly by the door before stepping forward, his expression grim and focused. Holmes greeted him with a brief nod, his sharp eyes calm, yet edged with an unspoken urgency. Lestrade explained that overnight inquiries into Forsyth's shipping manifests had borne fruit. His voice carried a restrained anger as he described what Scotland Yard had uncovered. Daniel Forsyth, under the discreet veil of private import licenses, had purchased a crate of raw African ebony logs 6 months earlier through a small shipping agency operating out of Liverpool. Alongside the timber shipment were sealed containers listed as botanical oils and ethnographic samples. Customs records revealed no detailed inspection, only Forsyth's personal assurance that the items were intended for scholarly cataloging and restoration of West African artifacts in his collection. Holmes listened without interruption, his posture still, his face shadowed by the lamplight above him. Lestrade continued, explaining that further investigation confirmed Forsyth had approached Belanti within days of receiving the shipment. He presented himself not merely as a collector, but as a benefactor seeking to commission an instrument of exceptional rarity, a violin carved entirely from African ebony, following the dimensions of historic bowed lutes found in early ethnographic sketches. Lestrade's voice dropped lower as he read from the written statement gathered by constables who had interviewed Belanti's apprentice. The young man, trembling and pale from grief, described overhearing Forsyth instruct Belanti to follow every aspect of the old legends. He insisted upon the Blackwood's traditional preparation, the carved markings along the violin's edges, and the use of hairstrings dyed to a specific brown-black shade. Most chillingly, he directed Belanti to finish the instrument with what he called a ritual blend, an oil mixture Forsyth himself had supplied, labeled only with foreign script neither the apprentice nor Belanti could read. Holmes closed his eyes briefly, exhaling a quiet breath as Lestrade fell silent. The clock upon the mantel ticked steadily, marking the slow passage of time within the hush that followed. Outside the windows, Baker Street was beginning to wake, hansom cabs rattling past in muted echoes, and newspaper boys calling their headlines into the damp morning air. Finally, Holmes spoke in a voice so low it seemed woven from the silence itself. He said that Forsyth's guilt was absolute, This was no ignorant collector who stumbled upon a cursed artifact. He sought it out, imported its components under false declarations, and orchestrated its recreation with exacting detail, ensuring that its deadly nature remained intact beneath its polished beauty. He rose then, tall and composed, his coat falling around him in sharp folds of black wool. His gray eyes carried the quiet certainty of a man who had seen the full arc of human cruelty and would not turn from its darkness. Holmes told Lestrade they would visit Forsyth without delay. This violin had already claimed 2 lives in madness and agony. If Forsyth planned a public showcase, as Holmes suspected, then dozens more stood in silent danger. Lestrade nodded, slipping his notebook back into his inner coat pocket before replacing his hat upon his thinning hair. I gathered my medical bag, my hands trembling slightly as I clasped its brass fastening shut. The thought of Forsyth standing in his gallery, surrounded by sacred masks, ivory carvings, and now this black violin dripping with poison and legend, filled me with a cold, steady disgust. Holmes paused by the window before we left, his gaze drifting out into the misty morning. The light was a pallid silver that blurred the street's edges into quiet shadows. He said softly, almost to himself, that there was no greater desecration than to twist beauty born of faith and suffering into a weapon of pride. Then he turned, his face once more composed into its sharp, unreadable calm. Together we followed Lestrade out into the damp London morning, the city awakening around us in soft murmurs and rattling wheels. Each step carried us closer to Forsyth's door and to the reckoning that awaited him there. The hansom cab carried us swiftly through the morning streets, its wheels hissing across rain-slick cobblestones as London awoke in subdued gray light. Shopkeepers raised their shutters with slow precision, milkmen moved silently between iron gates, and the muted clang of distant church bells drifted above the rooftops, marking the hour with calm solemnity. Inside the cab, Holmes sat beside Lestrade in complete stillness, his gaze locked upon the shifting fog beyond the window. His gray eyes, sharp with focus, betrayed no trace of hesitation or uncertainty. When we arrived at Forsyth's townhouse in Mayfair, the fog hung thick around its pale stone facade, wrapping its columns and balcony railings in a soft, ghostly veil. The brass nameplate upon the heavy front door glimmered faintly as Lestrade rapped the knocker with a deliberate force. Moments later, the butler appeared, dressed in his immaculate black morning coat, his expression unbothered as he stepped aside to allow us entry. The faint scent of polished wood and distant incense drifted from within, mingling with the chill dampness that clung to our coats. We were led through the familiar corridor, lined with maps and tribal masks, their hollow eyes staring out in silent witness as we passed. The polished oak floors gleamed under the glow of wall lamps, and faint strains of classical music reached our ears from deeper within the house. A soft piano etude played with effortless precision. The butler ushered us into Forsyth's smoking room, a large, richly furnished space lined with bookshelves filled to the ceiling. Heavy burgundy curtains framed tall windows overlooking the fog-bound garden beyond. The room smelled of leather, tobacco, and the subtle bitterness of aged whiskey. Daniel Forsyth stood near the marble hearth, swirling a glass of amber liquid in his hand, dressed in a dark green morning coat embroidered with black satin at the cuffs and collar. He turned as we entered, a faint smile playing across his pale, angular features. He greeted us calmly, his voice smooth and unhurried. His eyes flicked between Holmes and Lestrade with faint amusement before settling upon me with detached curiosity. He gestured casually to the armchairs arranged near the fire, inviting us to sit as though we were guests arriving for an idle conversation rather than the confrontation that weighed upon the room. Holmes remained standing. His tall figure cut a silent, formidable silhouette against the warm glow of the fireplace. He regarded Forsyth with unblinking stillness before speaking in a quiet, level tone. He told Forsyth that they knew about the poisoned oils blended with camphor and bitter resin, about the human hair strings, and about the legends that Forsyth had twisted into his own personal acquisition of power. His voice carried no anger, only a cold, unassailable certainty that cut deeper than any accusation. Forsyth tilted his head slightly as he listened, the faint smile never leaving his lips. He sipped his whiskey with elegant indifference before replying in his calm, measured voice. He said that art, by its very nature, demanded sacrifice. If lesser minds could not withstand the deeper truths woven into beauty, then their deaths were simply the price of experiencing it. Lestrade shifted beside me, his fists tightening at his sides, but Holmes remained utterly still, his gaze locked upon Forsyth's eyes with a quiet, merciless intensity. He asked him if Belanti knew the true purpose of the violin he was forced to create. Forsyth shrugged lightly, swirling his drink once more. He said that Belanti was a craftsman, and craftsmen existed to serve visionaries. He admitted that Belanti had hesitated when instructed to apply the ritual oil blend, but Forsyth assured him that it was merely traditional finishing oil required for authenticity. His tone suggested no remorse, only faint irritation at Belanti's reluctance. Holmes stepped closer, the subtle creak of the oak floor beneath his boots punctuating the silence. The lamplight cast shadows along the sharp lines of his face, illuminating his calm gray eyes that watched Forsyth as though seeing through him to some hidden rot beneath. He spoke softly, telling Forsyth that he had killed 2 people already, that each death was not an unfortunate accident, as he might claim, but murder committed through deliberate deception and concealed poison. Forsyth's smile widened slightly, revealing teeth that gleamed in the lamplight. He replied that their minds were simply too weak to hold the weight of true beauty. His voice carried a quiet, amused contempt, as he said that art was not for everyone. Only those with strength and vision could command it without being consumed. I felt a chill coil through my chest at his words, the same cold certainty I had felt standing in Belanti's workshop, seeing the violin's polished darkness, absorbing the lantern light into its silent depths. Holmes remained silent for a moment, his gaze locked upon Forsyth's face with an intensity that filled the quiet room with unspoken force. Then Holmes spoke, his voice still calm but edged with a steel resolve that reverberated through every shadowed corner of the room. He said that Forsyth's vision was nothing more than arrogance dressed in stolen ritual and poison, that true art elevated humanity while his desecrated it, leaving only madness and death in its wake. Forsyth's smile faded, replaced by a flicker of irritation as he placed his glass upon the marble mantel with deliberate precision. He turned away from us, adjusting the cuffs of his morning coat with casual elegance, dismissing Holmes's words as though they were dust upon his sleeve. In that moment, as the rain began to tap softly against the tall windows behind him, I saw clearly the depth of Forsyth's corruption. He was a man who believed that power justified cruelty, that possession of beauty excused the destruction it wrought upon others. His soul was untouched by grief or guilt, shielded behind the polished glass of his collections and the silent approval of his wealth. Holmes turned to Lestrade, his calm gray eyes meeting the inspector's in silent command. It was time. The reckoning Forsyth believed himself above had arrived, carried not by legends or poison, but by the quiet, inexorable justice of truth revealed. The afternoon passed in swift, silent preparation. Holmes and Lestrade departed Forsyth's townhouse under the watchful gaze of his butler, the heavy door closing behind them with a muffled finality. Outside, the rain had ceased, leaving the city damp and glistening under a pale, muted sky. Holmes walked with quiet purpose along the pavement, his long coat brushing against his boots with each stride, his eyes fixed ahead in silent calculation. We returned to Baker Street only briefly. Holmes sat by the window for a time, staring out at the drifting fog that hung low above the rooftops, the dying light turning its edges to faint violet and gold. He spoke little, his mind clearly distant, mapping each possibility and risk with silent precision. When he finally rose, it was with the calm certainty of a man whose course had been set and would not waver. By evening, we found ourselves standing before the grand entrance of Royal Albert Hall. The building loomed against the darkening sky, its wide dome crowned with pale gaslight that cast an otherworldly glow upon the gathering crowds below. Hansom cabs arrived in a steady stream along the Crescent Drive, their lanterns flickering in the fog as footmen assisted elegantly dressed ladies onto the pavement. The faint murmur of anticipation drifted from the queue. Dignitaries in dark tailcoats and gleaming medals, gentlemen in crisp white shirts and black cravats, and women wrapped in silk shawls and pearl earrings that caught the lamplight with each graceful movement. Inside, the vast auditorium hummed with quiet excitement. Rows of crimson velvet seats curved around the grand stage, their plush surfaces glowing beneath the ornate chandeliers suspended high above. The hall smelled of fresh polish and faint rosewater perfume, mingled with the subtle metallic scent of the instruments waiting upon the stage. At the center, upon a raised platform covered in deep black velvet, rested the ebony violin. Its surface shone under the brilliant gaslights, absorbing their glow into its endless darkness. Even from a distance, I felt its silent presence radiating outward like a quiet pulse, an object so beautiful it drew the eye despite the cold certainty of what lay hidden within its polished wood. Holmes stood beside me, his eyes scanning the hall with swift precision. His gaze passed over each uniformed guard stationed discreetly along the aisles, each dignitary greeting acquaintances with soft nods and polite murmurs. Lestrade approached from the opposite entrance, his blue greatcoat marking him distinctly among the gathered nobility. He nodded once to Holmes, a silent signal that Scotland Yard's officers were in place. As the seats filled, a hush fell across the hall. The chandeliers dimmed slightly, casting the room in a warm, intimate glow. On the stage, musicians in formal black began to tune their instruments, the low hum of cellos and whispering sighs of violins blending into a soft, anticipatory harmony. Holmes's gaze narrowed upon the raised platform where the ebony violin lay in its place of honor. He leaned closer to me, his voice low and calm despite the tension that radiated from him like heat from smoldering coal. He explained that Forsyth intended tonight not merely as a showcase of his collection, but as a declaration of power. Before royalty, dignitaries, and London's artistic elite, he would reveal the violin as the culmination of his ambition, the possession of beauty, stolen and twisted into silent dominion. I felt a cold tightness spread through my chest as I watched the violin gleam beneath the stage lights. The thought of its poison seeping into the skin of whatever musician dared lift it sent a faint tremor through my hands. Holmes placed a reassuring touch upon my sleeve. his gray eyes meeting mine with quiet, steady resolve. He said that tonight Forsyth would be exposed. His arrogance had blinded him to the certainty that true beauty, born of pain and history, could never remain silent forever. And though we stood within one of London's grandest halls, beneath glittering chandeliers and the quiet murmur of royalty, I felt in that moment that this place had become a courtroom. And before this gathering of unknowing witnesses, the truth hidden within ebony and poison would finally speak. The gaslights along the balconies flickered softly as the conductors stepped onto the stage to polite applause. The hush that settled over the hall felt absolute, pressing upon my ears with the quiet force of anticipation. Holmes straightened beside me, his shoulders squared and his gaze fixed upon Forsyth, who sat in the front row, his pale face composed into an expression of faint, triumphant amusement. As the orchestra began its first chords, the rich, sonorous music rising to fill the vaulted dome above, I felt the hush transform into a silence laden with unseen darkness. And deep within, I understood with absolute certainty that tonight would end not with applause, but with the quiet, final severing of a darkness disguised as beauty. The music flowed through Royal Albert Hall with a calm, majestic grace, each note rising to the vaulted dome above us before dissolving into the hush that filled every tiered seat. The orchestra played with quiet mastery, their movements precise and elegant under the warm, flickering chandeliers. Yet even as the polished tones of violins, cellos, and clarinets swept over the audience, my mind remained fixed upon Holmes, who stood beside me, silent and unmoving, his gray eyes locked upon the dark figure of Forsyth, seated in the front row. Forsyth sat with perfect composure, his dark morning coat tailored to immaculate precision, his posture straight and confident. The corners of his mouth curved into a faint smile as he watched the orchestra play, his gaze lingering with barely concealed pride upon the black violin resting upon its velvet pedestal at the center of the stage. Holmes remained still, his shoulders squared, his breathing steady and deep. In the dim lamplight filtering along the side aisles, I could see the sharp focus in his eyes, not the distant, meditative gaze he often wore when pondering unseen connections, but a bright, unblinking clarity that revealed each moment was being weighed, measured, and arranged within his mind. As the orchestra moved into the gentle diminuendo of their opening piece, Holmes leaned close to me and spoke in a voice so low it was nearly swallowed by the fading chords. He explained that Forsyth believed himself invulnerable, that any disruption to the evening's schedule would appear as an affront to royal dignity, ensuring the collector remained confident in his dominance. Holmes said that canceling the showcase outright would alert Forsyth to their investigation, allowing him to conceal evidence or flee before Scotland Yard could charge him with murder. Instead, Holmes planned to let the event proceed, ensuring that Forsyth's guilt would be revealed not by accusation alone, but through undeniable proof witnessed by the highest circles of London society. He outlined his plan with swift precision. Lestrade's men, scattered among the audience and stage staff, would guard the instrument, preventing any musician from lifting it until Holmes gave his signal. The moment Forsyth attempted to countermand their intervention, his reaction would reveal his knowledge of the violin's true nature. Only a man aware of its poison would fear its seizure, and Forsyth's arrogance, Holmes explained, would compel him to assert his control before so many powerful witnesses. I felt the tightness ease slightly within my chest as I listened to his calm, deliberate words. His strategy carried the quiet finality of a chess master, moving his pieces towards inevitable checkmate. This was not merely about preventing death. It was about exposing Forsyth's darkness in a place where he believed himself beyond judgment, forcing him to confront the truth of his own cruelty before the very society he sought to impress. Holmes straightened once more, adjusting the cuffs of his dark coat with silent precision. His gaze returned to Forsyth, who sat with serene satisfaction as the orchestra's final chord echoed through the hall, fading into the hush that followed. Applause rose in gentle waves from the audience, mingled with murmurs of appreciation for the flawless performance. The conductor bowed gracefully before stepping aside, making way for the evening's highlight, the unveiling of Forsyth's prized violin. Stagehands moved with quiet efficiency, wheeling a small platform into place and adjusting the velvet cloth to reveal the instrument in its full, polished darkness. Gaslight and chandelier glow fell upon the ebony wood, its surface so deeply black it seemed to draw the light inward, creating an illusion of endless depth. A faint murmur rose from the audience as they gazed upon it. Whispers of astonishment drifted along the rows, words of beauty, rarity, and breathtaking craftsmanship. Holmes's face remained calm and unreadable as he watched Forsyth lean forward in his seat, his pale fingers clasped together in quiet triumph. Holmes spoke softly then, telling me that tonight the violin's true lament would be heard, not through music, but through the revelation of every life it had consumed. And in that silent certainty that settled around his words, I understood that the next moments would end not with applause, but with the quiet final fall of Forsyth's mask. Outside, the fog pressed against the grand arched windows, silent and unmoving, as though London itself waited in patient witness for the darkness within Royal Albert Hall to be brought into the cold clarity of truth. The chandeliers dimmed slightly, casting the vast interior of Royal Albert Hall into a warm, golden twilight. The hushed murmurs of the audience faded into silence as the stagehand stepped away, leaving the ebony violin resting alone upon its raised velvet pedestal at the front of the stage. Its dark surface absorbed the light around it, creating an illusion of a void carved into the heart of the concert hall. Holmes stood beside me, his posture composed, his gaze locked upon the violin with a stillness that belied the intensity coiling within him. Lestrade moved discreetly among the rows of seats, nodding to the uniformed constables positioned along the aisles and near each exit. Their presence was subtle, masked beneath evening coats and polished shoes, yet their focus remained absolute, each man ready to intervene the moment Holmes gave his signal. The hall itself felt suspended in time, its elegant balconies and red velvet seats filled with London's most powerful dignitaries. Military officers in crisp scarlet uniforms sat beside elderly nobles draped in heavy metals, their polished brass and gold threads gleaming faintly under the gaslights. Gentlemen in black evening coats whispered softly to ladies adorned in silken gowns and diamonds, their fans fluttering with quiet anticipation. Further along the central rows, I saw a cluster of foreign ambassadors, their expressions polite and composed, observing the grandeur with diplomatic detachment. At the front, Forsyth sat alone in his reserved seat, his posture upright, his pale hands resting lightly upon his cane, topped with carved ivory. His expression carried a faint, amused serenity. The corners of his lips curled into the ghost of a smile as he gazed upon the violin before him. In that dim, golden glow, he looked almost statuesque, a figure carved from marble, untouched by the mortal concerns that weighed upon lesser men. The conductor, An elderly gentleman with silver hair and a dignified bearing stepped forward and raised his baton. The orchestra sat ready behind him, each musician poised in still anticipation, their instruments gleaming faintly beneath the stage lamps. The hush deepened until only the faint ticking of the grand clock above the main entrance echoed through the hall, marking each silent second before the music began. Then the conductor lowered his baton, and the orchestra moved as one, releasing a gentle cascade of sound into the waiting silence. The opening chords rose softly, each note shaped with perfect control, weaving together in delicate harmonies that drifted upward to the ornate dome far above. The music carried a solemn grace, filling the hall with a beauty so profound it seemed to still even the restless flicker of gaslight along the walls. I watched Holmes in that moment, standing tall beside me, his gray eyes steady upon the stage. There was no triumph or satisfaction in his expression, only a quiet, focused resolve. The plan he had orchestrated moved forward with silent precision, each moment leading towards the inevitable unveiling of Forsyth's guilt. As the orchestra reached the final bars of their opening piece, a hush fell once more, deeper and more anticipatory than before. All eyes turned towards the ebony violin resting upon its pedestal. The conductor turned, bowing his head slightly, as he gestured to the soloist waiting at the side of the stage, a young woman with dark hair pinned elegantly beneath a pearl comb, dressed in a flowing gown of pale silver that shimmered under the stage lights. She stepped forward with graceful composure, her slender hands folded lightly before her. The audience watched in rapt silence as she approached the pedestal, her gaze locked upon the black violin that gleamed with a quiet, ominous beauty in the golden lamplight. Beside me, Holmes's hand closed lightly around the handle of his cane, his knuckles tightening until the leather creaked faintly under his grip. His breathing remained calm and measured, but his focus sharpened with each step the soloist took towards the instrument. This was the moment upon which everything depended, the proof, the exposure, the final severing of Forsyth's shield of arrogance. The soloist paused before the pedestal, her eyes reflecting the violin's dark surface with quiet reverence. She reached out slowly, her fingers trembling faintly as they hovered just above the polished ebony wood. The hall seemed to hold its breath, the silence pressing down upon every person within it, waiting for the first note that would never come. Holmes turned his gaze upon Forsyth then. The collector sat utterly still, his pale eyes gleaming with cold triumph as he watched the soloist reach for the instrument. In that instant, I understood with absolute clarity that to Forsyth, this was not music. This was dominion. This was the final proof that beauty and suffering could be bent beneath his will and displayed as his own. The orchestra sat in poised silence. The chandeliers flickered softly, and the faint scent of rose oil and polished wood drifted through the heavy air. All the grandeur of London's power was gathered here, draped in velvet and gold, and at its center waited the violin, silent and deadly, ready to claim another life, in the name of art twisted into cruelty. Holmes exhaled slowly beside me, his voice a whisper so quiet only I could hear. "Now, Watson," and with that single word, the final act began. Holmes moved forward with quiet precision, his footsteps absorbed by the thick carpet that lined the side aisles of Royal Albert Hall. The chandeliers glowed softly overhead, casting warm pools of light across the velvet seats and gilded balconies. But my eyes remained fixed upon him alone. His tall figure cut a path through the hushed rows of dignitaries, each movement calm and unhurried, yet filled with an unspoken authority that drew the eyes of all who noticed his passing. The soloist remained frozen upon the stage, her slender hand hovering just above the ebony violin's polished surface. The conductor, sensing the shift in atmosphere, lowered his baton slightly, glancing towards Holmes as he stepped out from the shadows and ascended the side steps onto the stage itself. A faint ripple of murmurs spread through the audience, their whispers weaving together in hushed confusion. I saw Forsyth straighten slightly in his seat, his pale eyes narrowing with a flicker of irritation as Holmes approached the violin. That composed arrogance upon his face never faltered, but beneath it a subtle tension revealed itself. The faint tightening at the corners of his mouth, the slight flare of his nostrils as he drew in a deeper breath. Holmes paused before the soloist, offering her a small, polite nod before turning to address the conductor. His voice, calm and resonant, carried across the silent hall with quiet authority. He told them that before the violin could be played, there remained a final examination to ensure its structural integrity after its recent transport. His words were spoken with such unassailable composure that the conductor simply inclined his head, stepping back in silent agreement. Holmes then reached into the inner pocket of his coat and withdrew a small glass vial sealed with wax. Within it shimmered a pale golden liquid that caught the stage lights in faint flickering glints. He turned slightly towards me where I stood at the side of the stage, our eyes meeting in silent understanding. This was the decoy, the final protection against the poison that lay hidden upon the violin's surface. He spoke softly to the soloist, his words calm and kind, explaining that this vial contained an extract of distilled alkali compounds formulated to act as an immediate antidote to arsenic-based toxin. He told her that if, by chance, she felt sudden dizziness, blurred vision, or the sensation of crawling along her skin, she was to drink its contents without hesitation. Her eyes widened slightly, a faint tremor passing through her fingers as she accepted the vial from his gloved hand. She slipped it discreetly into the small pocket sewn within her gown's folds, nodding once in silent gratitude, though confusion and quiet fear shadowed her delicate features. Holmes then turned his attention fully to the violin. He slipped his gloves onto his hands with silent care, ensuring each finger was fitted precisely before reaching forward to lift the instrument from its velvet pedestal. The gaslight caught its ebony surface, casting its dark curves into an almost liquid depth, as though it absorbed the very glow around it. He brought the violin close to his face, inhaling lightly along its surface. The pungent bitterness of camphor and resin filled the quiet air around him, mingled with the sharp metallic scent of dried oil. I saw his eyes narrow slightly, his jaw tightening with restrained revulsion as he confirmed once more the presence of poison within its polished darkness. Slowly he turned towards the audience, holding the violin in both hands before him. From where I stood, I could see his gray eyes sweeping calmly across the gathered dignitaries, settling at last upon Forsyth, who sat motionless in his seat, their eyes locked, and though Forsyth's lips remained curved in their faint dismissive smile, the faint flicker of tension in his gaze betrayed him. Holmes spoke in a quiet, measured voice that carried effortlessly through the silent hall. He said that beauty was never born from suffering alone, nor could its true power be wielded through cruelty disguised as art. He told them that this violin, though carved with mastery, carried within it the silent lament of every life consumed in its making, and that no music it produced would ever be free of that darkness. Forsyth's fingers tightened upon the carved ivory head of his cane, the pale knuckles flashing briefly under the stage lights. His smile remained, but I saw it waver only for an instant as Holmes lowered the violin to his side with deliberate calm. The audience sat in utter silence, held captive not by music, but by the quiet, unbreakable truth that had begun to weave itself into the hall. Even the chandeliers seemed to burn more softly, their glow falling upon faces turned pale with growing unease. Holmes stepped back from the pedestal, returning the violin gently to its velvet rest. Then he inclined his head towards the soloist, gesturing for her to remain where she stood. Turning to the conductor, he spoke softly, his words carrying the subtle finality of command. The performance would proceed, but the violin would not be played tonight. Not here. Not ever again. As he descended the stage steps and rejoined me at the side aisle, I saw within his eyes the calm certainty of a man who knew the endgame was now in motion. Forsyth had been given the choice to speak his truth or be consumed by it, and as the hushed orchestra resumed their poised silence, I understood that this night's music would no longer be remembered for its beauty alone, but for the moment darkness itself was brought into the light. The hush within Royal Albert Hall deepened into an almost sacred silence as Holmes stepped away from the stage, his tall figure dissolving into the shadows beyond the footlights. The soloist remained before the ebony violin, her slender frame outlined in silver beneath the chandelier's glow. Her pale hands trembled faintly at her sides. The small vial of antidote, hidden within the folds of her gown, pressing cool and reassuring against her hip. For a long moment she stood unmoving, gazing upon the instrument resting upon its black velvet pedestal. Its polished ebony body absorbed the golden light around it, casting back nothing but an inky darkness that seemed to pulse with a silent, unfathomable depth. From my vantage point at the stage's edge, I could see the quiet dread tightening her features, the faint widening of her eyes as she beheld the violin's carved symbols glistening beneath the oil that Holmes had confirmed to be tainted with poison. The conductor stepped forward, his elegant posture stiffened with confusion and concern. He glanced towards Forsyth, seated in the front row, silently seeking permission to continue the performance as planned. Forsyth inclined his head in a barely perceptible nod, his pale lips curling once more into their familiar, faint smile, though his eyes flickered with an unspoken impatience. Holmes remained still at my side, his gray eyes fixed upon Forsyth with calm, unwavering focus. I could feel the quiet tension radiating from him, a silent force that held the moment in careful suspension. The soloist drew a slow, steadying breath before reaching forward with delicate gloved fingers. She lifted the violin from its pedestal with reverent caution, the carved scroll resting lightly against her thumb as she tilted the body to inspect its strings. The human hair, dyed brown-black and oiled to a faint sheen, glimmered softly beneath the chandeliers. For a heartbeat she paused, her gaze drifting along the carved calligraphic symbols, tracing the edges of the violin's belly. Her lips parted slightly as though to speak, but no words came. Then she turned towards the conductor and nodded once. He raised his baton, and the hush within the hall deepened until not even the faint rustle of silk or lace could be heard. The soloist lifted the violin to her shoulder, resting its chin cup against her pale jawline. Her bow hovered just above the strings, the poised grace of her posture hiding the faint tremor that passed through her arms. At the front of the hall, Forsyth leaned forward slightly in his seat. The warm stage light fell across his angular features, illuminating the cold gleam in his pale eyes. His fingers drummed lightly against his ivory cane, an unconscious rhythm of anticipation and pride. From where I stood, I saw the faint tightening at the corners of his mouth, the subtle flare of his nostrils as he drew a slow, steady breath. This was his moment, the unveiling of his masterpiece before royalty and power, a silent declaration of his dominion over history, beauty, and death. The soloist drew her bow gently across the strings, releasing a single soft note that drifted into the hush like a whispered prayer. Its tone was dark, resonant, carrying within it a richness that seemed too deep for so slight a body of wood to produce. The sound lingered upon the still air, vibrating against the vaulted dome above before fading into silence. She paused, her bow trembling faintly. Her eyes widened slightly, a flicker of confusion passing across her delicate features. For a moment she remained frozen, her breath catching in her throat, as though she sensed something unseen moving within the shadows of her mind. Then, with deliberate calm, she lowered the violin from her shoulder and turned towards the conductor, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall as she announced that she could not continue. A faint murmur rippled among the audience, a quiet wave of confusion and disappointment passing from seat to seat. The conductor glanced towards Forsyth, his brows knitting in polite apology, but Forsyth remained utterly still, his expression frozen in an unreadable calm. Only his eyes betrayed him, darkening with a quiet, gathering rage as the soloist stepped away from the pedestal, cradling the violin against her chest with the careful tenderness of a woman holding something both beautiful and cursed. Holmes exhaled softly beside me, his voice a low whisper only I could hear. He said that the antidote remained unneeded tonight, but its presence had given her the courage to resist. She had felt the faint touch of poison upon her skin, sensed the darkness it carried, and chosen life over music tainted with death. The chandeliers flickered softly above, casting the grand hall in a warm, trembling glow as the orchestra lowered their instruments in silent confusion. And in that hushed pause, as Forsyth sat motionless in his velvet seat, his pale eyes fixed upon the violin he believed no one could resist, I saw the first crack appear within his impenetrable composure. It was not anger alone that shadowed his gaze, but the dawning understanding that his power was slipping beyond his grasp. The soloist stepped off the stage with quiet dignity, the violin held loosely against her side, its dark surface gleaming like a sliver of night captured within her pale hands. And as she disappeared behind the heavy velvet curtains, the hush within Royal Albert Hall deepened into a silence that spoke not of beauty, but of a darkness finally brought into the light. The hush within Royal Albert Hall held firm, a silence so deep it seemed to press upon every velvet seat and gilded balcony with quiet, suffocating force. The soloist had vanished behind the heavy curtains, leaving the stage empty save for the black violin resting upon its pedestal, its polished ebony surface absorbing the gaslight into a silent, fathomless darkness. Holmes stepped forward into that hush with calm, deliberate grace. His tall figure moved down the central aisle, each step echoing softly against the marble floor as the gathered dignitaries and nobles turned their eyes towards him in quiet confusion. I followed closely behind, my heart pounding with attention, born not of fear, but of a silent certainty that this moment would end the darkness Forsyth had woven around himself. Forsyth sat motionless in his seat, his pale hands folded neatly upon his ivory cane, his expression composed into a faint, distant smile. Yet as Holmes approached, I saw the subtle tension gather along his jaw, the faint tightening at the corners of his mouth, betraying the storm brewing within. Holmes stopped before him, standing tall and still, his gray eyes locked upon Forsyth's with a quiet, unbreakable intensity. The silence between them pressed upon the hall, so complete that even the faint ticking of the grand clock above the entrance seemed muted beneath its weight. Holmes spoke softly, his voice carrying through the hall with calm, resonant clarity. He said that the poison hidden within the violin's oil had been revealed. Scotland Yard would test it within the hour, confirming what Holmes already knew, that its surface carried arsenic compounds and plant neurotoxins strong enough to drive any human mind into madness before it killed. A faint murmur rippled through the front rows, dignitaries shifting in their seats, their eyes darting between Holmes and Forsyth with growing unease. Yet Forsyth did not move. He sat utterly still, his faint smile never faltering as he regarded Holmes with a gaze filled with cold, quiet disdain. Holmes continued, his voice unwavering. He told Forsyth that two people were already dead: Matteo Bellanti, whose hands were severed to ensure his silence, and Sophia Carlin, who leapt from her balcony in a frenzy of poisoned terror. He asked him how many more lives he intended to claim to satisfy his desire for power disguised as art. For a long moment Forsyth said nothing. His pale eyes remained locked upon Holmes's, unblinking and filled with a quiet, poisonous amusement. Then he spoke, his voice low and smooth, carrying a calmness that felt colder than any rage. He said that they deserved it, each of them, that Bellanti had sold his craft to the highest bidder for decades, caring nothing for the sacred materials he carved apart. That Sophia Carlin, he claimed, had filled concert halls with music stolen from lands she never knew, performed upon instruments made from ivory and ebony ripped from their rightful places. Forsyth paused, his faint smile widening slightly as he leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly against his cane. He said that he had merely let their guilt consume them, that art was not a matter of beauty alone, but of truth revealed, no matter how dark it might prove to be. Holmes stood silent as Forsyth spoke, his eyes locked upon the man's face with calm, unflinching focus. In that stillness, the truth of Forsyth's words revealed themselves not as justice, but as a twisted satisfaction, a belief that his own cruelty could be excused by the sins of others. It was a confession unburdened by guilt or remorse, spoken with the certainty of a man who believed himself above any law but his own. Around us the quiet grew heavy, dignitaries shifting uncomfortably in their seats, whispers drifting along the velvet rows like faint winds through tall grass. Yet Forsyth remained unmoved, his pale eyes gleaming in the soft gaslight as he regarded Holmes with silent contempt. Holmes exhaled softly, the faintest tightening of his jaw the only sign of his disgust. Then he turned his gaze towards Lestrade, who stood waiting just beyond the central aisle, his blue greatcoat marking him out among the evening coats and military sashes. Lestrade nodded once, his expression grim as he stepped forward, the polished silver of his cuffs gleaming in the low light. And as Forsyth sat unmoving, his faint smile frozen upon his lips, the hush within Royal Albert Hall deepened into a silence no music could ever fill. It was the quiet that came before judgment, before the darkness he carried was taken from his grasp and laid bare before the world he believed he owned. The silence within Royal Albert Hall settled like a heavy shroud, pressing upon every polished balcony and crimson velvet seat with the quiet inevitability of dawn breaking upon a long, dark night. Lestrade stepped forward from his place near the aisle, his boots silent upon the thick carpet, as he approached Forsyth with calm, deliberate purpose. Forsyth remained seated, his posture perfectly composed, his pale hands folded neatly upon the carved ivory head of his cane. His faint smile never wavered, as Lestrade stopped before him, the silver badge of Scotland Yard gleaming softly against the dark blue of his greatcoat. Around them, the audience remained utterly still, nobles and dignitaries watching with wide, unblinking eyes as the silent tableau unfolded before them. Lestrade spoke quietly, his voice carrying only as far as Forsyth's ears. He informed him that he was under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, possession, and use of toxic substances with intent to harm, and for the deaths of Matteo Bellanti and Sophia Carlin, who had perished under the influence of the poison he commissioned. His words were spoken without anger, each syllable carrying only the calm, unbreakable certainty of justice delivered. Forsyth looked up at Lestrade then, his pale eyes gleaming with cold amusement. For a moment his smile widened, the fine lines at the corners of his lips deepening as though he were about to laugh. Instead, he spoke softly, his voice low and resonant, carrying a quiet contempt that reached only Holmes, Lestrade, and myself standing near. He said that art would always conquer law, that beauty, true beauty, demanded sacrifice, and that men like Holmes and Lestrade, bound by their petty codes and moral constraints, would never understand the freedom he had found within it. He told them that the deaths were not murders, but revelations. Each life claimed a testament to the darkness hidden within every human heart, a darkness that beauty alone could unmask. Lestrade did not respond. He simply reached forward with quiet finality and clasped the steel cuffs around Forsyth's slender wrists. The faint click of the lock echoed softly through the silent hall, louder than any whisper. Forsyth did not resist. He remained still, his gaze drifting away from Lestrade to rest upon Holmes, his smile fading into something smaller, colder, and devoid of amusement. Holmes met his gaze calmly, his gray eyes steady and unflinching. In that silent exchange, Forsyth seemed to see something that pierced beyond the surface of his own arrogance. His smile vanished entirely, leaving behind only the stark, frozen composure of a man who understood at last that his dominion had ended. Lestrade gestured to the two constables waiting near the side aisle. They stepped forward swiftly, their boots echoing faintly against the marble floor as they flanked Forsyth, guiding him gently to his feet. He rose without resistance, the cuffs glinting beneath the golden chandelier light as he turned to face the silent hall. For a moment he paused, his pale eyes sweeping across the gathered nobles, ambassadors, and military officers, as though memorizing each face. Then he allowed the constables to guide him down the central aisle, his polished shoes moving in quiet, measured steps upon the carpet. His cane remained behind, resting against his vacant seat, its carved ivory handle gleaming softly in the fading gaslight. As Forsyth passed, Holmes stood tall and silent, his posture composed, his gaze steady upon the man he had unmasked. Their eyes met one final time, and in that brief, silent glance, I saw no triumph within Holmes's expression, only a quiet, profound grief for the lives that had been stolen, and a calm, iron resolve that such darkness would never remain hidden again. The audience remained silent as Forsyth was led away, the faint clink of his cuffs the only sound in that vast, hushed hall. Outside, the fog pressed against the grand arched windows, silent and unmoving, as though London itself waited in quiet witness for the darkness within Royal Albert Hall to be carried away into the dawn. The fog clung to London long into the early hours, thickening into silent drifts along the deserted streets as our hansom cab rattled back towards Baker Street. The rhythmic clatter of hooves and wheels upon slick cobblestones filled the quiet with a muted, comforting repetition. Holmes sat opposite me in the dim lantern glow, his tall frame leaning slightly against the cab wall, his eyes half closed in thought. He had spoken little since Forsyth's arrest, and I sensed within him not triumph nor relief, but a solemn quiet that seemed to deepen with each passing mile. The lamplight cast fleeting shadows across his angular features, illuminating the faint creases of fatigue around his eyes and the calm, measured lines of his mouth. When we arrived at Baker Street, the house lay silent and dark beneath the drifting fog. Mrs. Hudson had left a lamp burning low in the sitting room, casting a warm, golden hush across the familiar space. Holmes removed his coat with silent precision, draping it across the back of his armchair before moving to the small table by the fireplace where his violin rested upon its stand. He stood there for a long moment, his fingers brushing lightly across the polished maple back of the instrument, as though feeling its silent resonance beneath his touch. Then he turned away and moved to the washstand in the corner of the room, where he poured carbolic solution into the small porcelain basin. I watched as he cleaned his hands slowly and thoroughly, his long fingers moving with deliberate care beneath the pale antiseptic-scented water. The faint bite of carbolic acid filled the air, mingling with the gentle warmth of burning coal drifting from the hearth. Each motion spoke not merely of cleansing, but of quiet ritual, as though he sought to wash away the remnants of darkness that clung invisibly to his skin and mind. Finally, he dried his hands upon a folded linen cloth and turned to face me. His gray eyes, clear and calm beneath the golden lamplight, carried within them the unspoken weight of all we had witnessed. Belanti's mutilated body upon the workshop floor, Sophia Carlin's madness and death, Durant's self-inflicted blindness, and Forsyth's cold, unflinching confession. Holmes spoke softly then, his voice low and measured, carrying no triumph nor bitterness. He said that art held within it the power to heal, to inspire, and to soothe, that music, sculpture, painting, and craft were each born of a quiet human need to reach beyond the limits of words and speak truths that lay hidden within the soul. But, he continued, in the wrong hands even beauty became a weapon, an instrument carved from sacred wood, an oil blended from ancestral ritual, a melody twisted from lament into command. All could be reshaped by cruelty and arrogance into tools of domination rather than truth. His eyes drifted briefly towards the darkened window beyond the lamp glow, where the fog pressed against the glass in soft, unbroken silence. Holmes fell quiet, and for a time the only sound within the room was the gentle crackle of burning coal within the hearth. Outside, the distant toll of church bells marked the slow passage of hours towards dawn, their quiet, melancholy peals carrying across the sleeping city in thin, fading echoes. Then, with a soft exhale, he turned from the window and moved back to his violin. He lifted it carefully from its stand and settled into his armchair, drawing the bow lightly across its strings. A single note rose into the quiet, warm, and mournful, carrying within it the softness of grief and the calm certainty of truth restored. I sat in my chair opposite him, watching as his fingers moved with effortless precision along the fingerboard, each note flowing into the next with a quiet grace that filled the sitting room with a gentle, solemn beauty. And in that moment, surrounded by the flickering lamplight and the drifting fog beyond the glass, I felt the weight of the night ease from my chest, replaced by a stillness that felt almost like peace. For Holmes, I realized, this was not merely a case concluded. It was another reminder that darkness could be hidden within even the most beautiful creations. And though he carried no illusions of erasing such darkness from the world, he would never cease to unmask it, ensuring that truth, however quiet, would always find its voice. The fog lingered long into the following morning, drifting past the tall windows of Baker Street in pale, silent currents that muffled the waking sounds of the city. The chiming bells of St. Marylebone drifted faintly across the rooftops. Each toll softened into a melancholy echo as Holmes and I sat before the hearth, the warmth of the coals radiating in comforting waves across the quiet sitting room. Holmes was lost in thought, his slender fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze fixed upon the gray light pressing against the glass. The violin rested upon his knee, silent and unplayed, as though he no longer sought sound, but only the quiet clarity that came with the closing of each dark chapter. A soft knock at the door drew us from the hush. Mrs. Hudson entered a moment later, her voice low as she announced that a visitor waited below, an older woman who refused tea, requesting only a moment of Holmes's time. Holmes nodded once, his gray eyes softening with an unreadable shadow as he rose from his chair. When the visitor stepped into the sitting room, I recognized her immediately from the newspaper sketches. Her dark hair was streaked with gray, pulled tightly beneath a modest black hat, trimmed in fading velvet. She wore a heavy morning coat, its sleeves slightly frayed at the cuffs, and a black gloves stained faintly with tears, absorbed during her long journey through the fog-bound streets. Her posture was straight despite her grief, and her eyes, red-rimmed and weary, carried the hollow depth of a woman who had wept beyond exhaustion. She introduced herself as Sophia Carlin's mother. Her voice trembled with quiet dignity as she explained she had come not to seek justice, for what justice could restore her daughter's laughter or the quiet grace of her music, but to understand why. Why a life so devoted to beauty and to the gentle healing of music had ended in madness and blood beneath a cold stone balcony. Holmes listened in still silence, his eyes lowered with quiet respect as she spoke. When she fell silent, her hands tightening around the small black reticule clutched against her chest, he reached for a folded envelope resting upon the small table beside his chair. Its seal was unbroken, bearing only a simple marking in wax, the insignia of Scotland Yard. Holmes stepped forward and placed the envelope gently into her trembling hands. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and low, carrying the quiet weight of truth delivered with mercy. He told her that her daughter's death had not been madness of the soul, nor a failing of her music or her mind. It had been murder, deliberate, calculated, and hidden within an instrument that carried poison upon its polished beauty. The woman's eyes widened slightly, filling with tears that trembled upon her lashes but did not fall. She clutched the envelope to her chest, her thin shoulders shaking with silent sobs as she bowed her head in grief. For a long moment the room held only the faint ticking of the mantel clock and the quiet hush of her sorrow. Finally she lifted her gaze to Holmes, her voice breaking as she whispered her thanks. She said that knowing the truth would not ease her pain, but it would end the torment of wondering if her daughter had chosen death over life. She turned towards the door then, her steps slow and unsteady, as Mrs. Hudson guided her back into the dim hallway beyond. Holmes remained standing long after she had gone, his slender figure outlined against the gray light pressing against the window. His eyes remained calm and composed, but I saw within them the quiet echo of grief. Not his own, but the grief he carried for those unable to speak for themselves, for the dead left voiceless by cruelty disguised as beauty, and for the living left to bear the silent weight of their loss. He turned to me at last, his voice soft as he said that sometimes the only justice left was truth delivered with quiet mercy. And as he returned to his chair, settling once more with his violin resting upon his knee, I felt a stillness settle across the room, deeper than silence. It was the stillness that came when a darkness was ended, not with triumph or victory, but with the calm certainty of compassion restored. Outside, the fog drifted past the tall windows, silent and pale, carrying with it the whispered promise of a dawn that would come, soft, gray, and unburdened by the shadows of the night now past. The fog began to thin by mid-morning, lifting slowly from the rooftops of Baker Street to reveal the pale blue promise of a London sky washed clean by days of silent rain. Light spilled through the tall windows, illuminating the quiet sitting room in soft golden clarity. Holmes sat in his armchair, his violin resting upon his knee, though he did not play. His eyes remained half-closed, his breathing calm and even, as though he allowed the hush to settle deep within his chest after the night's silent storms. Mrs. Hudson entered quietly, holding a small silver tray upon which rested a single folded envelope of thick cream paper. She set it upon the side table near Holmes before withdrawing with a respectful nod, leaving behind the faint scent of lavender soap and morning tea that always followed her presence. Holmes remained still for a moment, his eyes drifting open to regard the envelope without reaching for it. The royal insignia was pressed deeply into the dark blue wax seal, its ridges catching the sunlight in glimmering relief. Finally, he set aside his violin and took the envelope into his long, slender fingers, breaking the seal with silent precision. He read the letter in a hush, so deep I could hear the faint ticking of the mantel clock marking each passing second. When he lowered the paper, his expression remained composed and calm, but I saw within his eyes a quiet shadow of something unspoken, not pride nor triumph, but a still, reflective understanding of what his work demanded of him. He handed the letter to me without a word. I unfolded it carefully, feeling the smooth thickness of its fine parchment between my fingers. The words were written in an elegant, precise hand. Her Majesty, Queen Victoria, extends her gratitude to Mr. Sherlock Holmes for preventing a tragedy at last night's concert. His vigilance and intervention ensured the safety of the royal family and the gathered dignitaries. Her Majesty recognizes the quiet necessity of his work and trusts that his continued service to the crown will remain steadfast. I read the words twice, feeling a faint tightness gather in my chest. There was no poetic praise within the letter, no effusive commendation, only calm, dignified gratitude delivered with the quiet weight of royal acknowledgement. Yet I understood, as did Holmes, that these few words carried a power beyond medals or public declarations. They were an unspoken agreement between the crown and the man who stood in silent guardianship of its people, a promise that his work, though often unseen, would always be known where it mattered most. Holmes leaned back in his chair, folding his hands lightly upon his chest, his eyes drifting once more towards the tall windows where pale sunlight streamed through the thinning fog. For a long moment he remained silent, the letter resting upon the side table beside him, its seal catching the light in a quiet, unwavering glow. Finally he spoke, his voice low and calm, carrying only the faintest shadow of reflection. He said that gratitude, whether from the crown or a grieving mother, mattered only in so far as it ensured that truth continued to find its voice in a world so often deafened by greed and cruelty. Then he closed his eyes once more, his breathing evening into a silent, steady rhythm. The mantel clock ticked on, marking each quiet second as the sunlight grew brighter, filling the sitting room with a gentle warmth that felt almost like peace. Outside, the city stirred fully awake, the fog lifting from every narrow street and grand avenue, revealing the stone and iron heart of London in all its ancient dignity. And within Baker Street, I sat opposite Holmes in the hush of the morning, feeling the calm certainty settle within me that, for now, the darkness had been turned away once more. 2 days passed before Lestrade sent word that the final arrangements had been made. Holmes received the inspector's brief note over breakfast, reading it silently by the window as pale summer light spilled across the table, illuminating the neat lines of his folded newspaper and the quiet steam rising from his untouched tea. When he finished, he folded the note with deliberate precision and slipped it into his inner coat pocket, his gray eyes thoughtful beneath the calm composure of his expression. That afternoon, under a clear, solemn sky, we traveled to Scotland Yard by hansom cab. The streets bustled with life, costermongers calling their wares, children darting between iron lampposts in breathless games of chase, and women in dark skirts and pale blouses sweeping doorsteps free of yesterday's dust. Yet, despite the warmth and noise of the city, Holmes remained silent beside me, his gaze fixed steadily ahead, his long fingers drumming lightly against his cane in a rhythm I knew well, the silent measure of a mind absorbed in final considerations. At Scotland Yard, Lestrade met us in the wide stone entryway, his coat unbuttoned and his hair damp with sweat despite the mild breeze outside. He gestured for us to follow him down a short corridor and through a set of heavy iron doors. Beyond lay the yard's storage and evidence chambers, each lined with rows of shelves filled with confiscated weapons, crates of illegal spirits, and locked cabinets containing artifacts seized in cases that now slept forever in the archives of London's unsolved darkness. But at the far end of the corridor, under the watchful gaze of 2 constables standing guard, rested a single item upon a heavy oak table. Covered in black cloth, its shape was unmistakable. Even hidden beneath the draped fabric, the quiet presence of the violin could be felt within the hushed room, as though the air around it refused to move freely in its shadow. Lestrade approached first, his broad shoulders shifting beneath his worn greatcoat as he reached forward and folded back the cloth. The black violin lay revealed in the dim lamplight, its polished ebony surface gleaming with silent, fathomless depth. The carved symbols along its edges seemed to shimmer in the subdued glow, each marking filled with the dark oil that carried its silent poison. Holmes stepped forward, his posture tall and composed, his gloved hands clasped lightly behind his back. For a long moment he stood in silence, his gray eyes tracing every curve of the instrument with quiet, unwavering focus. I watched him closely, seeing the subtle tightening of his jaw and the faint shadows that deepened around his eyes. This was not triumph in his gaze, nor relief, only a solemn recognition of the lives it had claimed, and the darkness it carried within its silent beauty. Lestrade spoke then, his voice echoing softly off the stone walls. He explained that, by order of the Yard, and with full approval from the Crown's legal counsel, the violin was to be destroyed. No museum would house it. No collector would ever claim it. Its history, stained with suffering, madness, and death, would end here. Holmes inclined his head, once in silent approval. The constables lifted the violin with careful precision, carrying it across the chamber to the wide furnace that burned day and night at the far wall. Its iron doors glowed faintly with the steady heat within, filling the room with a sharp scent of coal smoke and scorched metal. As the violin was placed upon the iron grate within, Holmes remained utterly still, his eyes locked upon the instrument as flames licked along its polished ebony surface. The oil upon it caught fire first, sending thin, curling ribbons of dark smoke into the vent above. Then the wood itself began to darken, blister, and crack, the carved symbols splitting apart as the heat consumed their hidden poison. For a long moment, the violin remained silent within the flames, its body blackened but intact, as though resisting the finality of destruction. Then, with a sharp, echoing crack, its belly split apart, revealing the hollow darkness within, and the flames poured through its structure in bright, searing tongues of orange and gold. Lestrade turned away slightly, his face pale with the quiet horror of witnessing beauty undone by necessity. But Holmes did not move. His eyes remained upon the flames, reflecting their flickering light with a still, unblinking calm. Only when the last embers of the violin's body collapsed into blackened fragments did he exhale softly and lower his gaze. He turned to Lestrade and thanked him in his quiet, measured voice. The inspector nodded once, replying that it was better this way, that some things, no matter how rare or beautiful, carried darkness too great to remain in the world. As we stepped back into the cool afternoon air of London, the scent of burning wood and bitter resin still clinging faintly to our coats, Holmes paused upon the stone steps. He closed his eyes briefly, the summer breeze stirring the edges of his dark hair as he stood in silent reflection. Then he opened them once more, his gaze clear and calm, carrying the quiet certainty of a man who knew that while darkness could never be eradicated from the world, it could be revealed, unmasked, and ended before it claimed another life. Together we walked down the wide steps into the crowded street beyond, the sun breaking through the drifting clouds above to cast the city in gentle, golden light. That evening, after we returned to Baker Street, Holmes sat quietly by the window, his silhouette framed against the fading violet light of dusk. The city below drifted into its nocturnal hush, the distant rattle of wheels along Baker Street fading beneath the gentle whisper of summer winds, stirring the curtains beside him. He said nothing as I prepared tea, nor when Mrs. Hudson entered briefly to set a covered dish upon the side table, before departing again with a respectful nod. I sat at my small writing desk, the flickering lamplight illuminating the blank page before me, my pen resting motionless between my fingers. For a long time, I could not bring myself to write. My thoughts felt heavy, as though every word carried with it the shadow of the violin's silent darkness. Finally, I drew a slow breath and dipped my pen into the inkwell, the faint scratching of nib upon paper breaking the hush as I began my entry. That day, I wrote, we witnessed the final destruction of the ebony violin, an instrument carved from wood that was never meant to sing of human beauty, but which carried within it the silent weight of stolen life and twisted ritual. Each curve of its body, each carved symbol along its edges, each strand of hair spun into its strings told a history born of suffering, sanctity, and desecration. It was an instrument never meant to fill concert halls with applause, but to command, to enslave, and to kill. I paused for a moment, feeling the faint tremor in my fingers before continuing. Forsyth believed he owned beauty, that his wealth and knowledge gave him the right to take what was sacred and twist it into his own possession. Belanti died by his order, his hands severed to silence the truth. Sophia Carlin's life ended in terror and blood, her music drowned by a darkness she could neither name nor resist. Durant tore away his own sight to escape the visions the violin forced upon him. Each life lost was not an accident, nor an unintended consequence, but a sacrifice Forsyth believed justified in his pursuit of dominion. I watched Holmes that evening as he sat silent by the window, his gray eyes reflecting the dim lamplight with a quiet, solemn clarity. He spoke no words of victory, for there was none to be claimed. The violin's destruction had ended its darkness, but it could not restore the lives already consumed within its silent lament. Outside, the lamps flickered to life along Baker Street, casting their soft golden glow upon the drifting evening mist. Carriages passed in quiet procession, the muffled clatter of hooves upon cobblestone merging with the faint tolling of church bells, marking the hour. I set down my pen and closed my journal, the quiet finality of that motion settling deeply within me. There was no triumph in what we had done, only a necessary ending. The violin had been carved from stolen beauty, stained with human suffering, and played with poisoned pride. Its music would never again fill the world with madness disguised as art. Holmes rose from his chair and moved to his violin resting upon the side table. He lifted it gently, drawing the bow across its warm, maple body. A single note rose into the hush, deep and mournful, filling the room with a sound that spoke not of darkness, but of grief, mercy, and quiet remembrance. And as the note faded into silence, I felt the peace of that moment settle within me, like the hush that falls after the last toll of a bell. Outside, the city moved on, unknowing and untouched by the darkness that had been ended. But within Baker Street, we carried the quiet certainty that beauty, when twisted by cruelty, could always be unmasked, and that truth, however dark, would always find its voice in the end. Night fell upon London with quiet dignity, wrapping the city in soft, drifting shadows that settled between the tall rows of brownstone buildings and along the narrow alleys that curved away into darkness. The gas lamps flickered along Baker Street, casting small golden halos upon the damp pavement as hansom cabs rattled past, their wheels clattering softly against worn cobblestones. Within our sitting room, the lamps burned low, their glow illuminating the dark wood of the bookshelves and the quiet gleam of Holmes's violin resting upon the table. I sat in my chair near the hearth, the faint warmth of the dying coals drifting towards me in gentle waves, my medical journal open upon my knee, though I read not a single line. My eyes were drawn instead to Holmes, who stood before the window, his tall frame outlined against the dark glass. He held his violin lightly in one hand, the polished maple reflecting the muted lamplight in soft golden curves. The bow rested loosely between his fingers, its horsehair slack as though he had no intention to play. Outside, the fog drifted past the window in slow, silent currents, wrapping the gas lamps beyond in shifting veils of pale gray. Holmes remained still, his gaze fixed upon the street below, though I knew his eyes saw far beyond the fog-draped lamps and quiet carriages. His thoughts, I felt, moved deeper, into silent chambers of memory and reflection that I could never enter. After a long while, he raised the violin to his shoulder and drew the bow across its strings in a single, low note. The sound rose into the hush, warm and dark, filling the room with a quiet lament that seemed to drift through the glass and into the sleeping city beyond. His voice, when he spoke, carried softly over the fading resonance of the note, edged with a solemn calm that settled deeply within my chest. Music, he said, is humanity's greatest gift. Its beauty crosses all boundaries of language, culture, and grief. It soothes, uplifts, commands, and reveals what words can never hold. But even a single note, he continued, can kill if dipped in darkness. In the wrong hands, beauty becomes a weapon, silent and untraceable, hidden beneath admiration and praise. He fell silent then, drawing the bow lightly across the strings once more. releasing a series of quiet, contemplative chords that blended into the night beyond the glass. The flickering lamplight reflected in his gray eyes, casting fleeting gold within their calm depths. As he gazed into the fog outside, the faintest furrow shadowing his brow. I sat watching him, feeling the quiet certainty of his words settle around me like the hush before dawn. Holmes understood more deeply than any man I had known that beauty alone carried no morality. Its purpose lay within the intent of those who wielded it to heal, inspire, or destroy. And it was this knowledge that lent his work its unbreakable resolve, for he knew darkness could never remain hidden within beauty forever. Outside, the fog drifted past the window, silent and endless, wrapping London in a quiet, patient embrace as the city slept. And within our dimly lit sitting room, Holmes remained by the window, his violin resting upon his shoulder, the last dark chords of his playing echoing softly into the hush as he gazed into the shadows, his mind already moving towards the silent mysteries of tomorrow. Morning came quietly to Baker Street, the first pale rays of dawn filtering through the curtains to cast gentle lines of light upon the worn rug and polished wood floors. Outside, the city stirred awake in hushed rhythm, the soft roll of cartwheels upon stone, the distant call of milkmen, and the quiet clink of iron gates opening to greet the day. Within our sitting room, the air felt still and clean, as though the night's long shadows had lifted, leaving behind only the silent calm of a world returned to balance. I sat at my desk, closing the final page of my journal with deliberate care. The faint scent of ink lingered in the air as I pressed the brass clasp shut, feeling its quiet click echo into the hush of the room. My chest felt heavy, yet within that heaviness was a calm certainty, the knowledge that the darkness carried within the black violin had been ended, its silent lament destroyed before it could consume another life. Holmes stood by the hearth, his tall frame outlined against the quiet glow of the coals. He held his violin lightly in one hand, the bow resting across its strings, though he did not play. His gray eyes remained fixed upon the flames, their calm depths reflecting the gentle flicker of orange and gold. For a long moment he said nothing, the silence around him filled only with the faint ticking of the mantel clock and the soft whisper of morning wind against the window glass. Then he spoke, his voice low and steady, carrying with it the quiet, unbreakable truth of what we had witnessed. This violin, he said, was carved from stolen beauty, sacred wood cut down by human greed, shaped into an instrument of poisoned pride. Its music carried no grace, only the silent echoes of suffering and madness. Forsyth believed it was art because it commanded fear and death. But true art, he continued, reveals truth without cruelty. It heals rather than consumes. It is born of reverence, not arrogance. He fell silent again, lowering his gaze to the violin in his hand. His fingers brushed lightly along its polished maple back, feeling the warmth that lived within its grain, the quiet testament to the luthier's skill and the centuries of knowledge passed down through gentle hands. This, he said softly, is music as it was meant to be, a lament not of death, but of life remembered, mourned, and honored. The morning bells began to toll across London, their notes drifting in soft waves through the open window, mingling with the quiet hush that settled upon the street below. Holmes moved to the window then, parting the curtains to gaze out upon the waking city. The dawn light bathed his sharp features in pale gold, illuminating the calm lines of his face and the silent focus within his eyes. I rose from my chair and joined him at the window, following his gaze out across the rooftops, where the first thin trails of chimney smoke rose into the clear, brightening sky. For a long time, neither of us spoke. There was nothing left to say. The case was ended. The violin was gone, burned to ashes in the furnaces of Scotland Yard, its darkness ended by the same silent justice that had unmasked its maker. Yet as we stood there side by side, I felt the quiet echo of its lament remain within me, not as a haunting, but as a solemn remembrance of the lives it had touched, and of the truth Holmes had once spoken. Even a single note can kill if dipped in darkness. The violin was gone, but its story, the story of beauty corrupted, of genius twisted into cruelty, of sacredness stolen and silenced, would remain with us forever. A quiet warning hidden within the deeper truths of every mystery we would ever face. Holmes lowered the curtain and turned back to his chair, his violin cradled gently in his hands. As he settled into the hush of the morning, I returned to my desk and placed my journal upon the shelf among the quiet records of our many cases. Outside, the dawn brightened into full day, casting Baker Street in golden light. And within the silent sitting room, I felt the certainty settle deep within my chest that though darkness would rise again in many forms, so too would truth, quiet, steadfast, and unbreakable as the music of life itself. As the sun rose higher above London, filling Baker Street with soft golden warmth, I closed my eyes for a moment, listening to the quiet rhythm of the city beyond our window. The hush of dawn blended with the distant tolling of church bells and the gentle rustle of morning breezes stirring the curtains. In that stillness, I felt a sense of peace settle within me. The darkness of the ebony violin had passed, leaving behind only calm, a reminder that no matter how deep the shadows we face, morning will always come to wash them away. And so, wherever you are, as you listen to these words, may you feel this same quiet peace resting upon your thoughts. May your mind soften with ease, your breath deepen with calm, and your body become weightless in the quiet embrace of sleep. Rest now, knowing that beauty and truth remain, unbroken by darkness, carrying you gently into dreams where only light, warmth, and safety dwell. Good night.